The House of 1,000 Candles by Meredith Nicholson. Part 2. Chapter 11. I receive a caller. Going to bed at 3 o'clock on a winter morning in a house whose ways are disquieting, after a duel in which you escaped whole only by sheer good luck, does not fit one for sleep. When I finally drew the covers over me, it was to lie and speculate upon the events of the night in connection with the history of the few weeks I had spent at Glenarm. Larry had suggested in New York that Pickering was playing some deep game, and I myself could not accept Pickering's statement that my grandfather's large fortune had proved to be a myth. If Pickering had not stolen or dissipated it, where was it concealed? Morgan was undoubtedly looking for something of value, or he would not risk his life in the business, and it was quite possible that he was employed by Pickering to search for hidden property. This idea took strong hold of me, the more readily, I fear, since I had always been anxious to see evil in Pickering. There was, to be sure, the unknown alternative heir, but neither she nor Sister Teresa was, I imagined, a person capable of hiring an assassin to kill me. On reflection, I dismissed the idea of appealing to the county authorities, and I never regretted that resolution. The seat of Wabana County was 20 miles away, the processes of law were unfamiliar, and I wished to avoid publicity. Morgan might, of course, have been easily disposed of by an appeal to the Annandale constable, but now that I suspected Pickering of treachery, the caretaker's importance dwindled. I had waited all my life for a chance at Arthur Pickering, and in this affair I hoped to draw him into the open and settle with him. I slept presently, but woke at my usual hour, and after a tub felt ready for another day. Bates served me, as usual, a breakfast that gave a fair aspect to the morning. I was alert for any sign of perturbation in him, but I had already decided that I might as well look for emotion in a stone wall as in this placid, colorless serving man. I had no reason to suspect him of complicity in the night's affair, but I had no faith in him, and merely waited until he should throw himself more boldly into the game. By my plate, next morning I found this note, written in a clear, bold woman's hand. The Sisters of St. Agatha trust that the intrusion upon his grounds by Miss Armstrong, one of their students, has caused Mr. Glenarm no annoyance. The sisters beg that this infraction of their discipline will be overlooked, and they assure Mr. Glenarm that it will not recur. An unnecessary apology. The note paper was of the best quality. At the head of the page, St. Agatha's, Annandale, was embossed in purple. It was the first note I had received from a woman for a long time, and it gave me a pleasant emotion. One of the sisters I had seen beyond the wall undoubtedly wrote it, possibly Sister Teresa herself. A clever woman that, thoroughly capable of plucking money from guileless old gentlemen. Poor Olivia, born for freedom, but doomed to a pent-up existence with a lot of nuns. I resolved to send her a box of candy sometime, just to annoy her grim guardians. Then my own affairs claimed attention. Bates, I asked, do you know what Mr. Glenarm did with the plans for the house? He started slightly. I should not have noticed it if I had not been keen for his answer. No, sir. I can't put my hand upon them, sir. That's all very well, Bates, but you didn't answer my question. Do you know where they are? I'll put my hand on them if you will kindly tell me where they're kept. Mr. Glenarm, I fear very much that they have been destroyed. I tried to find them before you came, to tell you the whole truth, sir. But they must have been made way with. That's very interesting, Bates. Will you kindly tell me whom you suspect of destroying them? The toast again, please. His hand shook as he passed the plate. I hardly like to say, sir, when it's only a suspicion. Of course, I shouldn't ask you to incriminate yourself, but I'll have to insist on my question. It may have occurred to you, Bates, that I'm in a sense, mind you, the master here. Well, I should say, if you press me, that I fear Mr. Glenarm, your grandfather, burned the plans when he left here the last time. I hope you will pardon me, sir, for seeming to reflect upon him. Reflect upon the devil. What was his idea, do you suppose? I think, sir, if you will pardon, don't be so fussy. I snapped. Damn your pardon and go on. He wanted you to study out the place for yourself, sir. It was dear to his heart, this house. He set his heart upon having you enjoy it. I like the word. Go ahead. And I suppose there are things about it that he wished you to learn for yourself. You know them, of course, and are watching me to see when I'm hot or cold, like kids playing hide the handkerchief. The fellow turned and faced me across the table. Mr. Glenarm, as I hope God may be merciful to me in the last judgment, I don't know any more than you do. You were here with Mr. Glenarm all the time he was building the house, but you never saw walls built that weren't what they appeared to be, or doors made that didn't lead anywhere. I summoned all my irony and contempt for this arraignment. He lifted his hand, as though making oath. As God sees me, that is all true. I was here to care for the dead master's comfort, and not to spy on him. And Morgan, your friend, what about him? I wish I knew, sir. I wish to the devil you did, I said, and flung out of the room and into the library. At 11 o'clock, I heard a pounding at the great front door, and Bates came to announce a caller, who was now audibly knocking the snow from his shoes in the outer hall. The Reverend Paul Stoddard, sir. The chaplain of St. Agatha's was a big fellow, as I had remarked on the occasion of his interview with Olivia Gladys Armstrong by the wall. His light brown hair was close-cut. His smooth-shaven face was bright with the freshness of youth. Here was a sturdy young apostle without frills, but with a vigorous grip that left my hand tingling. His voice was deep and musical, a voice that suggested sincerity and inspired confidence. I'm afraid I haven't been neighborly, Mr. Glenarm. I was called away from home a few days after I heard of your arrival, and I have just got back. I blew in yesterday with the snowstorm. He folded his arms easily and looked at me with cheerful directness, as though politely interested in what manner of man I might be. It was a fine storm. I got a great day out of it, I said. An Indiana snowstorm is something I have never experienced before. This is my second winter. I came out here because I wished to do some reading, and thought I'd rather do it alone than in a university. Studious habits are rather forced on one out here, I should say. In my own case, my course of reading is all cut out for me. He ran his eyes over the room. The Glenarm collection is famous, the best in the country, easily. Mr. Glenarm, your grandfather, was certainly an enthusiast. I met him several times. He was a trifle hard to meet, and the clergyman smiled. I felt rather uncomfortable, assuming that he probably knew I was undergoing discipline, and why my grandfather had so ordained it. The Reverend Paul Stoddard was so simple, unaffected, and manly a fellow that I shrank from the thought that I must appear to him an ungrateful blackguard whom my grandfather had marked with obloquy. My grandfather had his whims, but he was a fine, generous-hearted old gentleman, I said. Yes, in my few interviews with him, he surprised me by the range of his knowledge. He was quite able to instruct me in certain curious branches of church history that had appealed to him. You were here when he built the house, I suppose? My visitor laughed cheerfully. I was on my side of the barricade for a part of the time. You know, there was a great deal of mystery about the building of this house. The country folk hereabouts can't quite get over it. They have a superstition that there's treasure buried somewhere on the place. You see, Mr. Glenarm wouldn't employ any local labor. The work was done by men he brought from afar. None of them, the villagers say, could speak English. They were all Greeks or Italians. I have heard something of the kind, I remarked, feeling that here was a man who with a little cultivating might help me to solve some of my riddles. You haven't been on our side of the wall yet? Well, I promise not to molest your hidden treasure if you'll be neighborly. I fear there's a big joke involved in the hidden treasure, I replied. I'm so busy staying at home to guard it that I have no time for social recreation. He looked at me quickly to see whether I was joking. His eyes were steady and earnest. The Reverend Paul Stoddard impressed me more and more agreeably. There was a suggestion of a quiet strength about him that drew me to him. I suppose everyone around here thinks of nothing but that I'm at Glenarm to earn my inheritance. My residence here must look pretty sordid from the outside. Mr. Glenarm's will is a matter of record in the county, of course. But you are too hard on yourself. It's nobody's business if your grandfather wished to visit his whims on you. I should say, in my own case, that I don't consider it any of my business what you are here for. I didn't come over to annoy you or to pry into your affairs. I get lonely now and then, and thought I'd like to establish neighborly relations. Thank you. I appreciate your coming very much, and my heart warmed under the manifest kindness of the man. And I hope, he spoke for the first time with restraint, I hope nothing may prevent your knowing Sister Teresa and Miss Devereux. They're interesting and charming. The only women about here of your own social status. My liking for him abated slightly. He might be a detective, representing the alternative heir, for all I knew, and possibly Sister Teresa was a party to the conspiracy. In time, no doubt in time, I shall know them, I answered evasively. Oh, quite as you like. And he changed the subject. We talked of many things, of outdoor sports, with which he showed great familiarity, of universities, of travel and adventure. He was a Columbia man and had spent 2 years at Oxford. Well, he exclaimed, this has been very pleasant, but I must run. I've just been over to see Morgan, the caretaker at the resort village. The poor fellow accidentally shot himself yesterday, cleaning his gun or something of that sort, and he has an ugly hole in his arm that will shut him in for a month or worse. He gave me an errand to do for him. He's a conscientious fellow and wished me to wire for him to Mr. Pickering that he'd been hurt, but was attending to his duties. Pickering owns a cottage over there, and Morgan is charge of it. You know Pickering, of course? I looked my clerical neighbor straight in the eye, a trifle coldly perhaps. I was wondering why Morgan, with whom I had enjoyed a duel in my own cellar only a few hours before, should be reporting his injury to Arthur Pickering. I think I have seen Morgan about here, I said. Oh yes, he's a woodsman and a hunter, our Nimrod of the lake. A good sort, very likely, I dare say. He has sometimes brought me ducks during the season. To be sure, they shoot ducks at night, these Hoosier hunters, so I hear. He laughed as he shook himself into his greatcoat. That's possible, though unsportsmanlike. But we don't have to look a gift mallard in the eye. We laughed together. I found that it was easy to laugh with him. By the way, I forgot to get Pickering's address from Morgan. If you happen to have it. With pleasure, I said. Alexis Building, Broadway, New York. Good. That's easy to remember, he said, smiling and turning up his coat collar. Don't forget me. I'm quartered in a hermit cell back of the chapel, and I believe we can find many matters of interest to talk about. I'm confident of it, I said, glad of the sympathy and cheer that seemed to emanate from his stalwart figure. I threw on my overcoat and walked to the gate with him, and saw him hurry toward the village with long strides. Chapter 12. I explore a passage. Bates. I found him busy replenishing the candlesticks in the library. It seemed to me that he was always poking about with an armful of candles. There are a good many queer things in this world, but I guess you're one of the queerest. I don't mind telling you that there are times when I think you a thoroughly bad lot. And then again I question my judgment and don't give you credit for being much more than a doddering fool. He was standing on a ladder beneath the great crystal chandelier that hung from the center of the ceiling, and looked down upon me with that patient injury that is so appealing in a dog, in, say, the eyes of an Irish setter, when you accidentally step on his tail. That look is heartbreaking in a setter, but, seen in a man, it arouses the direst homicidal feelings of which I am capable. Yes, Mr. Glenarm, he replied humbly. Now, I want you to grasp this idea that I'm going to dig into this old shell top and bottom. I'm going to blow it up with dynamite, if I please, and if I catch you spying on me, or reporting my doings to my enemies, or engaging in any questionable performances whatever, I'll hang you between the posts out there in the school wall. Do you understand? So that the sweet sisters of St. Agatha, and the dear little schoolgirls, and the chaplain, and all the rest will shudder through all their lives at the very thought of you. Certainly, Mr. Glenarm. And his tone was the same he would have used if I had asked him to pass me the matches, and under my breath I consigned him to the harshest tortures of the fiery pit. Now, as to Morgan. Yes, sir. What possible business do you suppose he has with Mr. Pickering? I demanded. Why, sir, that's clear enough. Mr. Pickering owns a house up the lake. He got it through your grandfather. Morgan has the care of it, sir. Very plausible. Indeed. And I sent him off to his work. After luncheon, I went below and directly to the end of the corridor, and began to sound the walls. To the eye they were all alike, being of cement, and substantial enough. Through the area window I saw the solid earth and snow. Surely there was little here to base hope upon, and my wonder grew at the ease with which Morgan had vanished through a barred window and into frozen ground. The walls at the end of the passage were as solid as rock, and they responded dully to the stroke of the hammer. I sounded them on both sides, retracing my steps to the stairway, becoming more and more impatient at my ill luck or stupidity. There was every reason why I should know my own house, and yet a stranger and an outlaw ran through it with amazing daring. After an hour's idle search, I returned to the end of the corridor, repeated all my previous soundings, and, I fear, indulged in language unbecoming a gentleman. Then, in my blind anger, I found what patient search had not disclosed. I threw the hammer from me in a fit of temper. It struck upon a large square in the cement floor, which gave forth a hollow sound. I was on my knees in an instant, my fingers searching the cracks, and drawing down close I could feel a current of air, slight but unmistakable, against my face. The cement square, though exactly like the others in the cellar floor, was evidently only a wooden imitation, covering an opening beneath. The block was fitted into its place with a nicety that certified to the skill of the hand that had adjusted it. I broke a blade of my pocket knife trying to pry it up, but in a moment I succeeded, and found it to be in reality a trapdoor, hinged to the substantial part of the floor. A current of cool, fresh air, the same that had surprised me in the night, struck my face as I lay flat and peered into the opening. The lower passage was as black as pitch, and I lighted a lantern I had brought with me, found that wooden steps gave safe conduct below, and went down. I stood erect in the passage and had several inches to spare. It extended both ways, running back under the foundations of the house. This lower passage cut squarely under the park before the house and toward the school wall. No wonder my grandfather had brought foreign laborers who could speak no English to work on his house. There was something delightful in the largeness of his scheme, and I hurried through the tunnel with 100 questions tormenting my brain. The air grew steadily fresher, until, after I had gone about 200 yards, I reached a point where the wind seemed to beat down on me from above. I put up my hands and found two openings about 2 yards apart, through which the air sucked steadily. I moved out of the current with a chuckle in my throat and a grin on my face. I had passed under the gate in the school wall, and I knew now why the piers that held it had been built so high. They were hollow and were the means of sending fresh air into the tunnel. I had traversed about 20 yards more when I felt a slight vibration accompanied by a muffled roar, and almost immediately came to a short wooden stair that marked the end of the passage. I had no means of judging directions, but I assumed I was somewhere near the chapel in the school grounds. I climbed the steps, noting still the vibration, and found a door that yielded readily to pressure. In a moment, I stood blinking, lantern in hand, in a well-lighted, floored room. Overhead, the tumult and thunder of an organ explained the tremor and roar I had heard below. I was in the crypt of St. Agatha's Chapel. The inside of the door by which I had entered was a part of the wainscoting of the room, and the opening was wholly covered with a map of the Holy Land. In my absorption, I had lost the sense of time, and I was amazed to find that it was 5 o'clock, but I resolved to go into the chapel before going home. The way up was clear enough, and I was soon in the vestibule. I opened the door, expecting to find a service in progress. But the little church was empty save where, at the right of the chancel, an organist was filling the church with the notes of a triumphant march. Cap in hand, I stole forward and sank down in one of the pews. A lamp over the organ keyboard gave the only light in the chapel, and made an aureole about her head, about the uncovered head of Olivia Gladys Armstrong. I smiled as I recognized her, and smiled, too, as I remembered her name. But the joy she brought to the music, the happiness in her face as she raised it in the minor harmonies, her isolation, marked by the little isle of light against the dark background of the choir. These things touched and moved me, and I bent forward, my arms upon the pew in front of me, watching and listening with a kind of awed wonder. Here was a refuge of peace and lulling harmony after the disturbed life at Glenarm, and I yielded myself to its solace with an inclination my life had rarely known. There was no pause in the outpouring of the melody. She changed stops and manuals with swift fingers and passed from one composition to another. Now it was an August hymn, now a theme from Wagner, and finally Mendelssohn's spring song leaped forth exultant in the dark chapel. She ceased suddenly with a little sigh and struck her hands together, for the place was cold. As she reached up to put out the lights, I stepped forward to the chancel steps. "Please allow me to do that for you?" She turned toward me, gathering a cape about her. "Oh, it's you, is it?" she asked, looking about quickly. "I don't remember. I don't seem to remember that you were invited. I didn't know I was coming myself, I remarked truthfully, lifting my hand to the lamp. That is my opinion of you, that you're a rather unexpected person. But thank you very much. She showed no disposition to prolong the interview, but hurried toward the door and reached the vestibule before I came up with her. You can't go any further, Mr. Glenarm, she said, and waited as though to make sure I understood. Straight before us through the wood and beyond the school buildings the sunset faded sullenly. The night was following fast upon the gray twilight, and already the bolder planets were aflame in the sky. The path led straight ahead beneath the black boughs. I might perhaps walk to the dormitory, or whatever you call it, I said. Think you know, I'm late and haven't time to bother with you. It's against the rules, you know, for us to receive visitors. She stepped out into the path. But I'm not a caller. I'm just a neighbor, and I owe you several calls anyhow. She laughed, but did not pause, and I followed a pace behind her. I hope you don't think for a minute that I chased a rabbit on your side of the fence just to meet you. Do you, Mr. Glenarm? Be it far from me. I'm glad I came, though, for I like your music immensely. I'm in earnest. I think it quite wonderful, Miss Armstrong. She paid no heed to me, and I hope I may promise myself the pleasure of hearing you often. You are positively flattering, Mr. Glenarm, but as I'm going away, I felt my heart sink at the thought of her going away. She was the only amusing person I had met at Glenarm, and the idea of losing her gave a darker note to the bleak landscape. That's really too bad. And just when we were getting acquainted, and I was coming to church every Sunday to hear you play and to pray for snow, so you'd come over often to chase rabbits. This, I thought, softened her heart. At any rate, her tone changed. I don't play for services. They're afraid to let me for fear I'd run comic opera tunes into the Tay Dam. How shocking. Do you know, Mr. Glenarm? Her tone became confidential and her pace slackened. We call you the Squire at St. Agatha's and the Lord of the Manor, and names like that. All the girls are perfectly crazy about you. They'd be wild if they thought I talked with you clandestinely. Is that the way you pronounce it? Anything you say, and any way you say it satisfies me, I replied. That's ever so nice of you, she said, mockingly again. I felt foolish and guilty. She would probably get roundly scolded if the Grave sisters learned of her talks with me, and very likely I should win their hearty contempt. But I did not turn back. I hope the reason you're leaving isn't, I hesitated. Ill conduct? Oh, yes. I'm terribly wicked, Squire Glenarm. They're sending me off. But I suppose they're awfully strict, the sisters. They're hideous. Perfectly hideous. Where is your home? I demanded. Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, perhaps? Humph, you are dull. You ought to know from my accent that I'm not from Chicago. And I hope I haven't a Kentucky girl's air of waiting to be flattered to death. And no Indianapolis girl would talk to a strange man at the edge of a deep wood in the gray twilight of a winter day. That's from a book, and the Cincinnati girl is without my elan, esprit, whatever you please to call it. She has more Teutonic repose, more of Gretchen of the Rhine Valley about her. Don't you adore French, Squire Glenarm? She concluded breathlessly, and with no pause in her quick step. I adore yours, Miss Armstrong, I asserted, yielding myself further to the joy of idiocy, and delighting in the mockery and changing moods of her talk. I did not make her out. Indeed, I preferred not to. I was not then, and I'm not now, thank God, of an analytical turn of mind. And as I grow older, I prefer, even after many a blow, to take my fellow human beings a good deal as I find them. And as for women, old or young, I envy no man his gift of resolving them into elements. As well carry a spray of arbutus to the laboratory, or subject the enchantment of moonlight upon running water to the flame, and blowpipe as try to analyze the heart of a girl, particularly a girl who paddles a canoe with a sure stroke and puts up a good race with a rabbit. A lamp shone ahead of us at the entrance of one of the houses, and lights appeared in all the buildings. If I knew your window, I should certainly sing under it. Except that you're going home. You didn't tell me why they were deporting you. I'm really ashamed to. You would never. Oh yes, I would. I'm really an old friend, I insisted, feeling more like an idiot every minute. Well, don't tell. But they caught me flirting with the grocery boy. Now aren't you disgusted? Thoroughly. I can't believe it. Why? You'd a lot better flirt with me, I suggested boldly. Well, I'm to be sent away for good at Christmas. I may come back then if I can square myself. My, that's slang. Isn't it horrid? The sisters don't like slang, I suppose. They loathe it. Miss Devereux, you know who she is. She spies on us and tells. You don't say so, but I'm not surprised at her. I've heard about her, I declared bitterly. We had reached the door, and I expected her to fly, but she lingered a moment. Oh, if you know her, perhaps you're a spy, too. It's just as well we should never meet again, Mr. Glenarm, she declared haughtily. The memory of these few meetings will always linger with me, Miss Armstrong, I returned in an imitation of her own tone. I shall scorn to remember you. And she folded her arms under the cloak tragically. Our meetings have been all too few, Miss Armstrong. 3 exactly, I believe. I see you prefer to ignore the first time I ever saw you, she said, her hand on the door. Out there in your canoe? Never. And you've forgiven me for overhearing you and the chaplain on the wall. Please. She grasped the knob of the door and paused an instant as though pondering. I make it 4 times, not counting once in the road, and other times when you didn't know, Squire Glenarm. I'm a foolish little girl to have remembered the first. I see now how blind I have been. She opened and closed the door softly, and I heard her running up the steps within. I ran back to the chapel, roundly abusing myself for having neglected my more serious affairs for a bit of silly talk with a schoolgirl, fearful lest the openings I had left at both ends of the passage should have been discovered. The tunnel added a new and puzzling factor to the problem already before me, and I was eager for an opportunity to sit down in peace and comfort to study the situation. At the chapel, I narrowly escaped running into Stoddard, but I slipped past him, pulled the hidden door into place, traversed the tunnel without incident, and soon climbed through the hatchway and slammed the false block securely into the opening. Chapter 13. A Pair of Eavesdroppers. When I came down after dressing for dinner, Bates called my attention to a belated mail. I pounced eagerly upon a letter in Lawrence Donovan's well-known hand, bearing, to my surprise, an American stamp and postmarked New Orleans. It was dated, however, at Veracruz, Mexico, December 15th, 1901. Dear old man, I have had a merry time since I saw you in New York. Couldn't get away for a European port, as I hoped when I left you, as the authorities seemed to be taking my case seriously, and I was lucky to get off as a deckhand on a southbound boat. I expected to get a slice of English prodigal veal at Christmas, but as things stand now, I am grateful to be loose even in this godforsaken hole. The British bulldog is eager to insert its teeth in my trousers, and I was flattered to see my picture bulletined in a conspicuous place the day I struck Veracruz. You see, they're badgering the government at home because I'm not apprehended, and they've got to catch and hang me to show that they've really got their hands on the Irish situation. I'm not afraid of the greasers. No people who gorge themselves with bananas and red peppers can be dangerous. But the British consul here has a bad eye, and even as I write, I am dimly conscious that a sleek person, who is ostensibly engaged in literary work at the next table, is really killing time while he waits for me to finish this screed. No doubt you are peacefully settled on your ancestral estate, with only a few months and a little patience between you and your grandfather's shire. You always were a lucky brute. People die just to leave you money, whereas I'll have to die to get out of jail. I hope to land under the stars and stripes within a few days, either across country through El Paso or via New Orleans, preferably the former, as a man's social position is rated high in Texas in proportion to the amount of reward that's out for him. They'd probably give me the freedom of the state if they knew my crimes had been the subject of debate in the House of Commons. But the man across the table is casually looking over here for a glimpse of my signature, so I must give him a good one, just for fun. With best wishes always, faithfully yours, George Washington Smith. P.S. I shan't mail this here, but give it to a red-haired Irishman on a steamer that sails north tonight. Pleasant, I must say, this eternal dodging. Wish I could share your rural paradise for the length of a pipe and a bottle. Have forgotten whether you said Indian Territory or Indiana, but we'll take chances on the latter as more remotely suggesting the Aborigines. Bates gave me my coffee in the library, as I wished to settle down to an evening of reflection without delay. Larry's report of himself was not reassuring. I knew that if he had any idea of trying to reach me, he would not mention it in a letter which might fall into the hands of the authorities, and the hope that he might join me grew. I was not, perhaps, entitled to a companion at Glenarm under the terms of my exile, but as a matter of protection in the existing condition of affairs there could be no legal or moral reason why I should not defend myself against my foes, and Larry was an ally worth having. In all my hours of questioning and anxiety at Glenarm, I never doubted the amiable intentions of my grandfather. His device for compelling my residence at his absurd house was in keeping with his character, and it was all equitable enough. But his dead hand had no control over the strange issue, and I felt justified in interpreting the will in the light of my experiences. I certainly did not intend to appeal to the local police authorities, at least not until the animus of the attack on me was determined. My neighbor, the chaplain, had inadvertently given me a bit of important news, and my mind kept reverting to the fact that Morgan was reporting his injury to the executor of my grandfather's estate in New York. Everything else that had happened was tame and unimportant compared with this. Why had John Marshall Glenarm made Arthur Pickering the executor of his estate? He knew that I detested him, that Pickering's noble aims and high ambitions had been praised by my family until his very name sickened me. And yet my own grandfather had thought it wise to entrust his fortune and my future to the man of all men who was most repugnant to me. I rose and paced the floor in anger. Instead of accepting Pickering's word for it that the will was all straight, I should have employed counsel and taken legal advice before suffering myself to be rushed away into a part of the world I had never visited before, and cooped up in a dreary house under the eye of a somber scoundrel who might poison me any day if he did not prefer to shoot me in my sleep. My rage must fasten upon someone, and Bates was the nearest target for it. I went to the kitchen, where he usually spent his evenings, to vent my feelings upon him, only to find him gone. I climbed to his room and found it empty. Very likely he was off condoling with his friend and fellow conspirator, the caretaker, and I fumed with rage and disappointment. I was thoroughly tired as on days when I had beaten my way through tropical jungles without food or water. But I wished, in my impotent anger against I knew not what agencies, to punish myself, to induce an utter weariness that would drag me exhausted to bed. The snow in the highway was well beaten down, and I swung off countryward past St. Agatha's. A gray mist hung over the fields in whirling clouds, breaking away occasionally and showing the throbbing winter stars. The walk and my interest in the alternation of star-lighted and mist-wrapped landscape won me to a better state of mind, and after tramping a couple of miles, I set out for home. Several times on my tramp, I had caught myself whistling the air of a majestic old hymn, and smiled, remembering my young friend Olivia and her playing in the chapel. She was an amusing child. The thought of her further lifted my spirit, and I turned into the school park as I passed the outer gate with a half-recognized wish to pass near the barracks where she spent her days. At the school gate, the lamps of a carriage suddenly blurred in the mist. Carriages were not common in this region, and I was not surprised to find that this was the familiar village hack that met trains day and night at Glenarm Station. Some parent, I conjectured, paying a visit to St. Agatha's. Perhaps the father of Miss Olivia Gladys Armstrong had come to carry her home for a stricter discipline than Sister Teresa's school afforded. The driver sat asleep on his box, and I passed him and went on into the grounds. A whim seized me to visit the crypt of the chapel and examine the opening to the tunnel. As I passed the little group of school buildings, a man came hurriedly from one of them and turned toward the chapel. I first thought it was Stoddard, but I could not make him out in the mist, and I waited for him to put 20 paces between us before I followed along the path that led from the school to the chapel. He strode into the chapel porch with an air of assurance, and I heard him address someone who had been waiting. The mist was now so heavy that I could not see my hand before my face, and I stole forward until I could hear the voices of the two men distinctly. "Bates?" "Yes, sir." I heard feet scraping on the stone floor of the porch. "This is a devil of a place to talk in, but it's the best we can do. Did the young man know I sent for you?" "No, sir. He was quite busy with his books and papers." "Humph. We can never be sure of him." "I suppose that is correct, sir. Well, you and Morgan are a fine pair. I must say, I thought he had some sense. and that you'd see to it that he didn't make a mess of this thing. He's in bed now with a hole in his arm, and you've got to go on alone. I'll do my best, Mr. Pickering. Don't call me by name, you idiot. We're not advertising our business from the housetops. Certainly not, replied Bates humbly. The blood was roaring through my head, and my hands were clenched as I stood there listening to this colloquy. Pickering's voice was, and is, unmistakable. There was always a purring softness in it. He used to remind me at school of a sleek, complacent cat, and I hate cats with particular loathing. Is Morgan lying or not when he says he shot himself accidentally? Demanded Pickering petulantly. I only know what I heard from the gardener here at the school. You'll understand, I hope, that I can't be seen going to Morgan's house. Of course not. But he says you haven't played fair with him, that you even attacked him a few days after Glenarm came. Yes, and he hit me over the head with a club. It was his indiscretion, sir. He wanted to go through the library in broad daylight, and it wasn't any use, anyhow. There's nothing there, but I don't like the looks of this shooting. Morgan's sick and out of his head, but a fellow like Morgan isn't likely to shoot himself accidentally. And now that it's done, the work's stopped, and the time is running on. What do you think Glenarm suspects? I can't tell, sir, but mighty little I should say. The shot through the window the first night he was here seemed to shake him a trifle, but he's quite settled down now, I should say, sir. He probably doesn't spend much time on this side of the fence. Doesn't haunt the chapel, I fancy. Lord, no, sir. I hardly suspect the young gentleman of being a praying man. You haven't seen him prowling about analyzing the architecture. Not a bit of it, sir. He hasn't, I should say, what his revered grandfather called the analytical mind. Hearing yourself discussed in this frank fashion by your own servant is, I suppose, a wholesome thing for the spirit. The man who stands behind your chair may acquire, in time, some special knowledge of your mental processes by a diligent study of the back of your head. But I was not half so angry with these conspirators as with myself, for ever having entertained a single generous thought toward Bates. It was, however, consoling to know that Morgan was lying to Pickering, and that my own exploits in the house were unknown to the executor. Pickering stamped his feet upon the paved porch floor in a way that I remembered of old. It marked a conclusion, and prelude serious statements. Now, Bates, he said, with a ring of authority and speaking in a louder key than he had yet used, it's your duty under all the circumstances to help discover the hidden assets of the estate. We got to pluck the mystery from that architectural monster over there, and the time for doing it is short enough. Mr. Glenarm was a rich man. To my own knowledge, he had a couple of millions, and he couldn't have spent it all on that house. He reduced his bank account to a few $1,000s and swept out his safety vault boxes with a broom before his last trip into Vermont. He didn't die with the stuff in his clothes, did he? Lord bless me, no, sir. There was little enough cash to bury him. With you out of the country and me alone with him. He was a crank, and I suppose he got a lot of satisfaction out of concealing his money. But this hunt for it isn't funny. I supposed, of course, we'd dig it up before Glenarm got here, or I shouldn't have been in such a hurry to send for him. But it's over there somewhere, or in the grounds. There must be a plan of the house that would help. I'll give you $1,000 the day you wire me. You have found any sort of clue. Thank you, sir. I don't want thanks. I want the money or securities or whatever it is. I've got to go back to my car now, and you'd better skip home. You needn't tell your young master that I've been here. I was trying hard to believe, as I stood there with clenched hands outside the chapel porch, that Arthur Pickering's name was written in the list of directors of one of the greatest trust companies in America, and that he belonged to the most exclusive clubs in New York. I had run out for a walk with only an Inverness over my dinner jacket, and I was thoroughly chilled by the cold mist. I was experiencing, too, an inner cold as I reflected upon the greed and perfidy of man. Keep an eye on Morgan, said Pickering. Certainly, sir, and be careful what you write or wire. I'll mind those points, sir. But I'd suggest, if you please, sir, well, demanded Pickering impatiently, that you should call at the house. It would look rather strange to the young gentleman if you'd come here and not see him. I haven't the slightest errand with him. And besides, I haven't time. If he learns that I've been here, you may say that my business was with Sister Teresa, and that I regretted very much not having an opportunity to call on him. The irony of this was not lost on Bates, who chuckled softly. He came out into the open and turned away toward the Glenarm gate. Pickering passed me, so near that I might have put out my hand and touched him, and in a moment I heard the carriage drive off rapidly toward the village. I heard Bates running home over the snow and listened to the clatter of the village hack as it bore Pickering back to Annandale. Then out of the depths of the chapel porch, out of the depths of time and space, it seemed so dazed I stood. Someone came swiftly toward me, someone light of foot like a woman, ran down the walk a little way into the fog and paused. An exclamation broke from me. Eavesdropping for two. It was the voice of Olivia. "I'd take pretty good care of myself, if I were you, Squire Glenarm. Good night. Goodbye," I faltered, as she sped away into the mist toward the school. Chapter 14. The Girl in Gray. My first thought was to find the crypt door and return through the tunnel before Bates reached the house. The chapel was open, and by lighting matches I found my way to the map and panel. I slipped through and closed the opening, then ran through the passage with gratitude for the generous builder who had given it a clear floor and an ample roof. In my haste, I miscalculated its length and pitched into the steps under the trap at a speed that sent me sprawling. In a moment more I had jammed the trap into place and was running up the cellar steps, breathless, with my cap smashed down over my eyes. I heard Bates at the rear of the house and knew I had won the race by a scratch. There was but a moment in which to throw my coat and cap under the divan, slap the dust from my clothes, and seat myself at the great table, where the candles blazed tranquilly. Bates' step was as steady as ever. There was not the slightest hint of excitement in it, as he came and stood within the door. "Beg pardon, Mr. Glenarm. Did you wish anything, sir?" "Oh, no. Thank you, Bates. I had stepped down to the village, sir, to speak to the grocer. The eggs he sent this morning were not quite up to the mark. I have warned him not to send any of the storage article to this house." "That's right, Bates." I folded my arms to hide my hands, which were black from contact with the passage, and faced my manservant. My respect for his rascally powers had increased immensely since he gave me my coffee. A contest with so clever a rogue was worthwhile. "I'm grateful for your good care of me, Bates. I had expected to perish of discomfort out here, but you are treating me like a lord." "Thank you, Mr. Glenarm. I do what I can, sir." He brought fresh candles for the table candelabra, going about with his accustomed noiseless step. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine as he passed behind me on these errands. His transition from the role of conspirator to that of my flawless servant was almost too abrupt. I dismissed him as quickly as possible and listened to his step through the halls as he went about locking the doors. This was a regular incident, but I was aware tonight that he exercised what seemed to me a particular care in settling the bolts. The locking up process had rather bored me before. Tonight the snapping of bolts was particularly trying. When I heard Bates climbing to his own quarters, I quietly went the rounds on my own account and found everything as tight as a drum. In the cellar, I took occasion to roll some barrels of cement into the end of the corridor to cover and block the trapdoor. Bates had no manner of business in that part of the house, as the heating apparatus was under the kitchen and accessible by an independent stairway. I had no immediate use for the hidden passage to the chapel, and I did not intend that my enemies should avail themselves of it. Morgan, at least, knew of it, and, while he was not likely to trouble me at once, I had resolved to guard every point in our pleasant game. I was tired enough to sleep when I went to my room, and after an eventless night, woke to a clear day and keener air. "I'm going to take a little run into the village, Bates," I remarked at breakfast. "Very good, sir. The weather's quite cleared. If anyone should call, I'll be back in an hour or so." "Yes, sir." He turned his impenetrable face toward me as I rose. There was, of course, no chance whatever that anyone would call to see me. The Reverend Paul Stoddard was the only human being, except Bates, Morgan, and the man who brought up my baggage, who had crossed the threshold since my arrival. I really had an errand in the village. I wished to visit the hardware store and buy some cartridges, but Pickering's presence in the community was a disturbing factor in my mind. I wished to get sight of him, to meet him if possible, and see how a man, whose schemes were so deep, looked in the light of day. As I left the grounds and gained the highway, Stoddard fell in with me. "Well, Mr. Glenarm, I'm glad to see you abroad so early. With that library of yours, the temptation must be strong to stay within doors. But a man's got to subject himself to the sun and wind. Even a good wedding now and then is salutary. I try to get out every day, I answered. But I've chiefly limited myself to the grounds. Well, it's a fine estate. The lake is altogether charming in summer. I quite envy you your fortune. He walked with a long, swinging stride, his hands thrust deep into his overcoat pockets. It was difficult to accept the idea of so much physical strength being wasted in the mere business of saying prayers in a girls' school. Here was a fellow who should have been captain of a ship or a soldier, a leader of forlorn hopes. I felt sure there must be a weakness of some sort in him. Quite possibly it would prove to be a mild aestheticism that delighted in the savor of incense and the mournful cadence of choral vespers. He declined a cigar, and this rather increased my suspicions. The village hack, filled with young women, passed at a gallop, bound for the station, and we took off our hats. Christmas holidays, explained the chaplain. Practically all the students go home. Lucky kids, to have a Christmas to go home to. I suppose Mr. Pickering got away last night, he observed, and my pulse quickened at the name. I haven't seen him yet, I answered guardedly. Then of course he hasn't gone, and these words, uttered in the big clergyman's deep tones, seemed wholly plausible. There was, to be sure, nothing so unlikely as that Arthur Pickering, executor of my grandfather's estate, would come to Glenarm without seeing me. Sister Teresa told me this morning he was here. He called on her and Miss Devereux last night. I haven't seen him myself. I thought possibly I might run into him in the village. His car is very likely on the station switch. No doubt we shall find him there, I answered easily. The Annandale station presented an appearance of unusual gaiety when we reached the main street of the village. There, to be sure, lay a private car on the siding, and on the platform was a group of 20 or more girls, with several of the brown-habited sisters of St. Agatha. There was something a little foreign in the picture. The girls in their bright colors talking gaily, the sisters in their somber garb hovering about, suggesting France or Italy rather than Indiana. I came here with the idea that St. Agatha's was a charity school, I remarked to the chaplain. Not a bit of it. Sister Teresa is really a swell, you know, and her school is hard to get into. I'm glad you warned me in time. I had thought of sending over a sack of flour occasionally, or a few bolts of calico, to help on the good work. You've saved my life. I probably have. I might mention your good intentions to Sister Teresa. Pray don't. If there's any danger of meeting her on that platform. No, she isn't coming down, I'm sure. But you ought to know her, if you will pardon me. And Miss Devereux is charming. But really I don't mean to be annoying. Not in the least. But under the circumstances, the will and my probationary year, you can understand. Certainly. A man's affairs are his own, Mr. Glenarm. We stepped upon the platform. The private car was on the opposite side of the station and had been switched into a siding of the East and West Road. Pickering was certainly getting on. The private car, even more than the yacht, is the symbol of plutocracy, and gaping rustics were evidently impressed by its grandeur. As I lounged across the platform with Stoddard, Pickering came out into the vestibule of his car, followed by two ladies and an elderly gentleman. They all descended and began a promenade of the plank walk. Pickering saw me an instant later and came up hurriedly with outstretched hand. This is indeed good fortune. We dropped off here last night rather unexpectedly to rest a hot box and should have been picked up by the midnight express for Chicago, but there was a miscarriage of orders somewhere, and we now have to wait for the 9 o'clock, and it's late. If I'd known how much behind it was, I should have run out to see you. How are things going? As smooth as a whistle. It really isn't so bad when you face it. And the fact is I'm actually at work. That's splendid. The year will go fast enough, never fear. I suppose you pine for a little human society now and then. A man can never strike the right medium in such things. In New York we are all rushed to death. I sometimes feel that I'd like a little rustication myself. I get nervous, and working for corporations is wearing. The old gentleman there is Taylor, president of the Interstate and Western. The ladies are his wife and her sister. I'd like to introduce you. He ran his eyes over my corduroys and leggings amiably. He had not in years addressed me so pleasantly. Stoddard had left me to go to the other end of the platform to speak to some of the students. I followed Pickering rather loathly to where the companions of his travels were pacing to and fro in the crisp morning air. I laugh still whenever I remember that morning at Annandale Station. As soon as Pickering had got me well underway in conversation with Taylor, He excused himself hurriedly and went off, as I assumed, to be sure the station agent had received orders for attaching the private car to the Chicago Express. Taylor proved to be a supercilious person. I believe they call him Chilly Billy at the Metropolitan Club, and our efforts to converse were pathetically unfruitful. He asked me the value of land in my county, and as my ignorance on this subject was vast and illimitable, I could see that he was forming a low opinion of my character and intelligence. The two ladies stood by, making no concealment of their impatience. Their eyes were upon the girls from St. Agatha's on the other platform, whom they could see beyond me. I had jumped the conversation from Indiana farmlands to the recent disorders in Bulgaria, which interested me more when Mrs. Taylor spoke abruptly to her sister. "That she, the one in the gray coat, talking to the clergyman. She came a moment ago in the carriage. The one with the umbrella? I thought you said—" Mrs. Taylor glanced at her sister warningly, and they both looked at me. Then they sought to detach themselves and moved away. There was someone on the farther side of the platform whom they wished to see, and Taylor, not understanding their maneuver, he was really anxious, I think, not to be left alone with me, started down the platform after them, I following. Mrs. Taylor and her sister walked to the end of the platform and looked across, a biscuit toss away, to where Stoddard stood talking to the girl I had already heard described as wearing a gray coat and carrying an umbrella. The girl in gray crossed the track quickly and addressed the two women cordially. Taylor's back was to her, and he was growing eloquent in a mild, well-bred way over the dullness of our statesmen in not seeing the advantages that would accrue to the United States in fostering our shipping industry. His wife, her sister, and the girl in gray were so near that I could hear plainly what they were saying. They were referring apparently to the girl's refusal of an invitation to accompany them to California. "So you can't go. It's too bad. We had hoped that when you really saw us on the way you would relent," said Mrs. Taylor. "But there are many reasons, and above all Sister Teresa needs me." It was the voice of Olivia, a little lower, a little more restrained than I had known it. "But think of the rose gardens that are waiting for us out there," said the other lady. They were showing her the deference that elderly women always have for pretty girls. "Alas, and again alas," exclaimed Olivia. "Please don't make it harder for me than necessary. But I gave my promise a year ago to spend these holidays in Cincinnati." She ignored me wholly, and after shaking hands with the ladies returned to the other platform. I wondered whether she was overlooking Taylor on purpose to cut me. Taylor was still at his lecture on the needs of our American merchant marine when Pickering passed hurriedly, crossed the track, and began speaking earnestly to the girl in gray. "The American flag should command the seas. What we need is not more battleships but more freight carriers," Taylor was saying. But I was watching Olivia Gladys Armstrong, in a long skirt, with her hair caught up under a gray toque that matched her coat perfectly. She was not my Olivia of the Tam O'Shanter, who had pursued the rabbit, nor yet the unsophisticated schoolgirl who had suffered my idiotic babble, nor, again, the dreamy rapt organist of the chapel. She was a grown woman with at least 20 summers to her credit, and there was about her an air of knowing the world, and of not being at all a person one would make foolish speeches to. She spoke to Pickering gravely. Once she smiled dolefully and shook her head, and I vaguely strove to remember where I had seen that look in her eyes before. Her gold beads, which I had once carried in my pocket, were clasped tight about the close collar of her dress, and I was glad, very glad, that I had ever touched anything that belonged to her. As the years go by, we are going to dominate trade more and more. Our manufacturers already lead the world, and what we make we've got to sell, haven't we?" demanded Taylor. "Certainly, sir," I answered warmly. Who was Olivia Gladys Armstrong, and what was Arthur Pickering's business with her? And what was it she had said to me that evening when I had found her playing on the chapel organ? So much happened that day that I had almost forgotten, and indeed, I had tried to forget I had made a fool of myself for the edification of an amusing little schoolgirl. "I see you prefer to ignore the first time I ever saw you," she had said, but if I had thought of this at all, it had been with righteous self-contempt. Or I may have flattered my vanity with the reflection that she had eyed me, her hero, perhaps, with wistful admiration across the wall. Meanwhile, the Chicago Express roared into Annandale, and the private car was attached. Taylor watched the trainmen with the cool interest of a man for whom the proceeding had no novelty, while he continued to dilate upon the nation's commercial opportunities. I turned perforce and walked with him back toward the station, where Mrs. Taylor and her sister were talking to the conductor. Pickering came running across the platform with several telegrams in his hand. The express had picked up the car and was ready to continue its westward journey. "I'm awfully sorry, Glenarm, that our stop's so short." And Pickering's face wore a worried look as he addressed me, his eyes on the conductor. "How far do you go?" I asked. "California. We have interests out there, and I have to attend some stockholders' meetings in Colorado in January." "Ah, you businessmen, I said reproachfully. I wished to call him a blackguard then and there, and it was on my tongue to do so, but I concluded that to wait until he had shown his hand fully was the better game. The ladies entered the car, and I shook hands with Taylor, who threatened to send me his pamphlet on the needs of American shipping when he got back to New York. It's too bad she wouldn't go with us. Poor girl. This must be a dreary hole for her. She deserves wider horizons, he said to Pickering, who helped him upon the platform of the car with what seemed to be unnecessary precipitation. "You little know us," I declared for Pickering's benefit. "Life at Annandale is nothing if not exciting. The people here are indifferent marksmen, or there'd be murders galore." "Mr. Glenarm is a good deal of a wag," explained Pickering dryly, swinging himself aboard as the train started. "Yes, it's my humor that keeps me alive," I responded, and taking off my hat, I saluted Arthur Pickering with my broadest salaam. Chapter 15. I make an engagement. The southbound train had not arrived, and as I turned away, the station agent again changed its time on the bulletin board. It was now due in 10 minutes. A few students had boarded the Chicago train, but a greater number still waited on the farther platform. The girl in gray was surrounded by half a dozen students, all talking animatedly. As I walked toward them, I could not justify my stupidity in mistaking a grown woman for a schoolgirl of 15 or 16. But it was the tam o' shanter, the short skirt, the youthful joy in the outdoor world that had disguised her as effectually as Rosalind to the eyes of Orlando in the Forest of Arden. She was probably a teacher, quite likely the teacher of music, I argued, who had amused herself at my expense. It had seemed the easiest thing in the world to approach her with an apology or a farewell. But those few inches added to her skirt, and that pretty gray toque substituted for the tam o' shanter, set up a barrier that did not yield at all as I drew nearer. At the last moment, as I crossed the track and stepped upon the other platform, it occurred to me that while I might have some claim upon the attention of Olivia Gladys Armstrong, a wayward schoolgirl of athletic tastes, I had none whatever upon a person whom it was proper to address as Miss Armstrong, who was, I felt sure, quite capable of snubbing me if snubbing fell in with her mood. She glanced toward me and bowed instantly. Her young companions withdrew to a conservative distance. And I will say this for the street Agatha girls. Their manners are beyond criticism, and an affable discretion is one of their most admirable traits. I didn't know they ever grew up so fast, in a day and a night. I was glad I remembered the number of beads in her chain. The item seemed at once to become important. It's the air, I suppose. It's praised by excellent critics, as you may learn from the catalog. But you are going to an ampler ether, a diviner air. You have attained the beatific state and at once take flight. If they confer perfection like an academic degree at St. Agatha's, then I had never felt so stupidly helpless in my life. There were 1,000 things I wished to say to her. There were countless questions I wished to ask, but her calmness and poise were disconcerting. She had not, apparently, the slightest curiosity about me, and there was no reason why she should have. I knew that well enough. Her eyes met mine easily. Their azure depths puzzled me. She was almost but not quite someone I had seen before, and it was not my woodland Olivia. Her eyes, the soft curve of her cheek, the light in her hair, but the memory of another time, another place, another girl, lured only to baffle me. She laughed, a little murmuring laugh. "I'll never tell if you won't," she said, "but I don't see how that helps me with you." "It certainly does not. That is a much more serious matter, Mr. Glenarm. And the worst of it is that I haven't a single thing to say for myself. It wasn't the not knowing that was so utterly stupid. Certainly not. It was talking that ridiculous twaddle. It was trying to flirt with a silly schoolgirl. What will do for 15 is somewhat vacuous for her." She paused abruptly, colored, and laughed. I am 27, and I am just the usual age, she said. Ages don't count, but time is important. There are many things I wish you'd tell me. You who hold the key of the gate of mystery. Then you'll have to pick the lock. She laughed lightly. The somber sisters patrolling the platform with their charges heated us little. I had no idea you knew Arthur Pickering, when you were just Olivia in the Tam O'Shanter. Maybe you think you wouldn't have cared for my acquaintance, as Olivia in the Tam O'Shanter. Men are very queer, but Arthur Pickering is an old friend of mine. So he told me. We were neighbors in our youth. I believe I have heard him mention it. And we did our prep school together, and then parted. You tell exactly the same story, so it must be true. He went to college, and you went to tech, and you knew him. I began, my curiosity thoroughly aroused. Not at college, any more than I knew you at tech. The train's coming, I said earnestly, and I wish you would tell me. When I shall see you again, before we part forever. There was a mischievous hint of the Olivia in short skirts in her tone. Please don't suggest it. Our times have been strange and few. There was that first night, when you called to me from the lake. How impertinent! How dare you? Remember that? And there was that other encounter at the chapel porch. Neither you nor I had the slightest business there. I admit my own culpability. She colored again. But you spoke as though you understood what you must have heard there. It is important for me to know. I have a right to know just what you meant by that warning. Real distress showed in her face for an instant. The agent and his helpers rushed the last baggage down the platform, and the rails hummed their warning of the approaching train. I was eavesdropping on my own account, she said hurriedly and with a note of finality. I was there by intention, and there was another hint of the Tam O'Shanter in the mirth that seemed to bubble for a moment in her throat. It's too bad you didn't see me, for I had on my prettiest gown, and the fog wasn't good for it. But you know as much of what was said there as I do. You are a man, and I have heard that you have had some experience in taking care of yourself, Mr. Glenarm. To be sure, but there are times. Yes, there are times when the odds seem rather heavy. I have noticed that myself. She smiled, but for an instant the sad look came into her eyes. A look that vaguely, but insistently suggested another time and place. I want you to come back, I said boldly, for the train was very near, and I felt that the eyes of the sisters were upon us. You cannot go away where I shall not find you. I did not know who this girl was, her home, or her relation to the school, but I knew that her life and mine had touched strangely, that her eyes were blue, and that her voice had called to me twice through the dark, in mockery once and in warning another time, and that the sense of having known her before, of having looked in her eyes, haunted me. The youth in her was so luring. She was at once so frank and so guarded. Breeding and the taste and training of an ampler world than that of Annandale were so evidenced in the witchery of her voice, in the grace and ease that marked her every motion, in the soft gray tone of hat, dress, and gloves, that a new mood, a new hope and faith sang in my pulses. There, on that platform, I felt again the sweet heartache I had known as a boy, when spring first warmed the Vermont hillsides, and the mountains sent the last snows, singing in joy of their release down through the brook beds and into the wakened heart of youth. She met my eyes steadily. If I thought there was the slightest chance of my ever seeing you again, I shouldn't be talking to you here. But I thought it would be good fun to see how you really talk to a grown-up. So I am risking the displeasure of these good sisters just to test your conversational powers, Mr. Glenarm. You see how perfectly frank I am? But you forget that I can follow you. I don't intend to sit down in this hole and dream about you. You can't go anywhere, but I shall follow and find you. That is finely spoken, Squire Glenarm, but I imagine you are hardly likely to go far from Glenarm very soon. It isn't, of course, any of my affair, and yet I don't hesitate to say that I feel perfectly safe from pursuit. And she laughed her little low laugh that was delicious in its mockery. I felt the blood mounting to my cheek. She knew, then, that I was virtually a prisoner at Glenarm, and for once in my life, at least, I was ashamed of my folly that had caused my grandfather to hold and check me from the grave, as he had never been able to control me in his life. The whole countryside knew why I was at Glenarm, and that did not matter, but my heart rebelled at the thought that this girl knew and mocked me with her knowledge. I shall see you Christmas Eve, I said, wherever you may be. In 3 days? Then you will come to my Christmas Eve party. I shall be delighted to see you. And flattered. Just think of throwing away a fortune to satisfy one's curiosity. I'm surprised at you, but gratified on the whole, Mr. Glenarm. I shall give more than a fortune. I shall give the honor I have pledged to my grandfather's memory to hear your voice again. That is a great deal. For so small a voice, but money fortune. A man will risk his honor readily enough, but his fortune is a more serious matter. I'm sorry we shall not meet again. It would be pleasant to discuss the subject further. It interests me particularly. In 3 days I shall see you, I said. She was instantly grave. No, please do not try. It would be a great mistake. And, anyhow, you can hardly come to my party without being invited. That matter is closed. Wherever you are on Christmas Eve, I shall find you, I said, and felt my heart leap, knowing that I meant what I said. Goodbye, she said, turning away. I'm sorry I shan't ever chase rabbits at Glenarm any more, or paddle a canoe, or play wonderful celestial music on the organ, or be an eavesdropper or hear pleasant words from the master of Glenarm. But I don't know where you are going. You haven't told me anything. You are slipping out into the world. She did not hear or would not answer. She turned away and was at once surrounded by a laughing throng that crowded about the train. 2 brown-robed sisters stood like sentinels, one at either side, as she stepped into the car. I was conscious of a feeling that from the depths of their hoods they regarded me with unchristian disdain. Through the windows, I could see the students fluttering to seats, and the girl in gray seemed to be marshalling them. The gray hat appeared at a window for an instant, and a smiling face gladdened, I am sure, the guardians of the peace at St. Agatha's, for whom it was intended. The last trunk crashed into the baggage car, every window framed for a moment a girl's face, and the train was gone. Chapter 16. The Passing of Olivia. Bates brought a great log and rolled it upon exactly the right spot on the andirons, and a great constellation of sparks thronged up the chimney. The old relic of a house. I called the establishment by many names, but this was, I think, my favorite, could be heated in all its habitable parts, as Bates had demonstrated. The halls were of glacial temperature these cold days, but my room above, the dining room, and the great library were comfortable enough. I threw down a book and knocked the ashes from my pipe. Bates? Yes, sir. I think my spiritual welfare is in jeopardy. I need counsel, a spiritual advisor. I'm afraid that's beyond me, sir. I'd like to invite Mr. Stoddard to dinner, so I may discuss my soul's health with him at leisure. Certainly, Mr. Glenarm. But it occurs to me that probably the terms of Mr. Glenarm's will point to my complete sequestration here. In other words, I may forfeit my rights by asking a guest to dinner. He pondered the matter for a moment, then replied, I should think, sir, as you ask my opinion, that in the case of a gentleman in holy orders there would be no impropriety. Mr. Stoddard is a fine gentleman. I heard your late grandfather speak of him very highly. That, I imagine, is hardly conclusive in the matter. There is the executor. To be sure, I hadn't considered him. Well, you'd better consider him. He's the court of last resort, isn't he? Well, of course, that's one way of looking at it, sir. I suppose there's no chance of Mr. Pickering's dropping in on us now, and then? He gazed at me steadily, unblinkingly, and with entire respect. He's a good deal of a traveler, Mr. Pickering is. He passed through only this morning, so the mailboy told me. You may have met him at the station. Oh, yes, to be sure. So I replied. I was not as good a liar as Bates, and there was nothing to be gained by denying that I had met the executor in the village. I had a very pleasant talk with him. He was on the way to California with several friends. That is quite his way, I understand. Private cars and long journeys about the country. A very successful man is Mr. Pickering. Your grandfather had great confidence in him, did Mr. Glenarm. Ah, yes. A fine judge of character my grandfather was. I guess John Marshall Glenarm could spot a rascal about as far as any man in his day. I felt like letting myself go before this masked scoundrel. The density of his mask was an increasing wonder to me. Bates was the most incomprehensible human being I had ever known. I had been torn with 1,000 conflicting emotions since I overheard him discussing the state of affairs at Glenarm House with Pickering in the chapel porch, and Pickering's acquaintance with the girl in gray brought new elements into the affair that added to my uneasiness. But here was a treasonable dog on whom the stress of conspiracy had no outward effect whatever. It was an amazing situation, but it called for calmness and eternal vigilance. With every hour, my resolution grew to stand fast and fight it out on my own account without outside help. 1,000 times during the afternoon, I had heard the voice of the girl in gray saying to me, "You are a man, and I have heard that you have had some experience in taking care of yourself, Mr. Glenarm." It was both a warning and a challenge, and the memory of the words was at once sobering and cheering. Bates waited. Of him, certainly, I should ask no questions touching Olivia Armstrong. To discuss her with a blackguard servant, even to gain answers to baffling questions about her, was not to my liking. And, thank God, I taught myself one thing, if nothing more, in those days at Glenarm House. I learned to bide my time. "I'll give you a note to Mr. Stoddard in the morning. You may go now." "Yes, sir." The note was written and dispatched. The chaplain was not at his lodgings, and Bates reported that he had left the message. The answer came presently by the hand of the Scotch gardener, Ferguson, a short, wiry, raw-boned specimen. I happened to open the door myself and brought him into the library until I could read Stoddard's reply. Ferguson had, I thought, an uneasy eye, and his hair, of an ugly carrot color, annoyed me. Mr. Paul Stoddard presented his compliments and would be delighted to dine with me. He wrote a large, even hand, as frank and open as himself. "That is all, Ferguson," and the gardener took himself off. Thus it came about that Stoddard and I faced each other across the table in the refectory that same evening under the lights of a great candelabrum which Bates had produced from the storeroom below. And I may say here that while there was a slight hitch sometimes in the delivery of supplies from the village, while the fish which Bates caused to be shipped from Chicago for delivery every Friday morning failed once or twice, and while the grapefruit for breakfast was not always what it should have been, the supply of candles seemed inexhaustible. They were produced in every shade and size. There were enormous ones, such as I had never seen outside of a Russian church, and one of the rooms in the cellar was filled with boxes of them. The House of 1,000 Candles deserved and proved its name. Bates had certainly risen to the occasion. Silver and crystal of which I had not known before glistened on the table, and on the sideboard 2 huge candelabra added to the festival air of the little room. Stoddard laughed as he glanced about. "Here I have been feeling sorry for you, and yet you are living like a prince. I didn't know there was so much splendor in all Wabana County. I'm a trifle dazzled myself. Bates has tapped a new cellar somewhere. I'm afraid I'm not a good housekeeper, to speak truthfully. There are times when I hate the house, when it seems wholly ridiculous, the whim of an eccentric old man. And then again, I'm actually afraid that I like its seclusion. Your seclusion is better than mine. You know my little 2-room affair behind the chapel. Only a few books and a punching bag. That chapel also is one of your grandfather's whims. He provided that all the offices of the church must be said there daily or the endowment is stopped. Mr. Glenarm lived in the past, or liked to think he did. I suppose you know, or maybe you don't know, how I came to have this appointment. Indeed, I should like to know." We had reached the soup, and Bates was changing our plates with his accustomed light hand. "It was my name that did the business, Paul. A bishop had recommended a man whose given name was Ethelbert, a decent enough name and one that you might imagine would appeal to Mr. Glenarm. But he rejected him because the name might too easily be cut down to Ethel, a name which, he said, was very distasteful to him. That is characteristic. The dear old gentleman," I exclaimed with real feeling. "But he reckoned without his host," Stoddard continued. "The young ladies, I have lately learned, call me Pauline as a mark of regard or otherwise, probably otherwise. I give 2 lectures a week on church history, and I fear my course isn't popular. But it is something, on the other hand, to be in touch with such an institution. They are a very sightly company, those girls. I enjoy watching them across the garden wall, and I had a closer view of them at the station this morning, when you ran off and deserted me." He laughed, his big, wholesome, cheering laugh. "I take good care not to see much of them socially. Afraid of the eternal feminine? Yes, I suppose I am. I'm preparing to go into a brotherhood, as you probably don't know, and girls are distracting. I glanced at my companion with a new inquiry and interest. I didn't know, I said. Yes, I'm spending my year in studies that I may never have a chance for hereafter. I'm going into an order whose members work hard. He spoke as though he were planning a summer outing. I had not sat at meat with a clergyman since the death of my parents broke up our old home in Vermont, and my attitude toward the cloth was, I fear, one of antagonism dating from those days. Well, I saw Pickering after all, I remarked. Yes, I saw him too. What is it in his case? Genius or good luck? I'm not a competent witness, I answered. I'll be frank with you. I don't like him. I don't believe in him. Oh, I beg your pardon. I didn't know, of course. The subject is not painful to me, I hastened to add, though he was always rather thrust before me as an ideal back in my youth. And you know how fatal that is. And then the gods of success have opened all the gates for him. Yes, and yet, I repeated. Stoddard lifted a glass of sherry to the light and studied it for a moment. He did not drink wine, but was not, I found, afraid to look at it. And yet, he said, putting down the glass and speaking slowly, when the gates of good fortune open too readily and smoothly, they may close sometimes rather too quickly and snap a man's coattails. Please don't think I'm going to afflict you with shavings of wisdom from the shop floor, but life wasn't intended to be too easy. The spirit of man needs arresting and chastening. It doesn't flourish under too much fostering or too much of what we call good luck. I'm disposed to be afraid of good luck. I've never tried it, I said laughingly. I am not looking for it, and he spoke soberly. I could not talk of Pickering with Bates, the masked beggar, in the room, so I changed the subject. I suppose you impose penances, prescribe discipline for the girls at St. Agatha's. An agreeable exercise of the priestly office, I should say. His laugh was pleasant and rang true. I was liking him better the more I saw of him. Bless you, no, I am not venerable enough. The sisters attend to all that. And a fine company of women they are. But there must be obstinate cases. One of the young ladies confided to me, I tell you this in cloistral confidence, that she was being deported for insubordination. Ah, that must be Olivia. Well, her case is different. She is not one girl. She is many kinds of a girl in one. I fear Sister Teresa lost her patience and hardened her heart. I should like to intercede for Miss Armstrong, I declared. The surprise showed in his face, and I added, Pray don't misunderstand me. We met under rather curious circumstances, Miss Armstrong and I. She is usually met under rather unconventional circumstances, I believe, he remarked dryly. My introduction to her came through the kitten she smuggled into the alms box of the chapel. It took me 2 days to find it. He smiled ruefully at the recollection. She's a young woman of spirit, I declared defensively. She simply must find an outlet for the joy of youth. Paddling a canoe, chasing rabbits through the snow, placing kittens in durance vile. But she's demure enough when she pleases, and a satisfaction to the eye. My heart warmed at the memory of Olivia. Verily the chaplain was right. She was many girls in one. Stoddard dropped a lump of sugar into his coffee. Miss Devereux begged hard for her, but Sister Teresa couldn't afford to keep her. Her influence on the other girls was bad. That's to Miss Devereux's credit, I replied. You needn't wait, Bates. Olivia was too popular. All the other girls indulged her. And I'll concede that she's pretty. That gypsy face of hers bodes ill to the hearts of men. If she ever grows up, I shouldn't exactly call it a gypsy face. And how much more should you expect her to grow? At 20 a woman's grown, isn't she? He looked at me quizzically. 15, you mean? Olivia Armstrong. That little witch, the kid that has kept the school in turmoil all the fall. There was decided emphasis in his interrogations. I'm glad your glasses are full. Or I should say, there was, I think, a little heat for a moment on both sides. The wires are evidently crossed somewhere, he said calmly. My Olivia Armstrong is a droll child from Cincinnati, whose escapades cause her to be sent home for discipline today. She's a little mite who just about comes to the lapel of your coat. Her eyes are as black as midnight. Then she didn't talk to Pickering and his friends at the station this morning. The prettiest girl in the world, gray hat, gray coat, blue eyes. You can have your Olivia. But who, will you tell me, is mine? I pounded with my clenched hand on the table until the candles rattled and sputtered. Stoddard stared at me for a moment, as though he thought I had lost my wits. Then he lay back in his chair and roared. I rose, bending across the table toward him in my eagerness. A suspicion had leaped into my mind, and my heart was pounding as it roused 1,000 questions. The blue-eyed young woman in gray? Bless your heart, man, Olivia is a child. I talked to her myself on the platform. You were talking to Miss Devereux. She isn't Olivia. She's Marion. Then, who is Marion Devereux? Where does she live? What is she doing here? Well, he laughed. To answer your questions in order, she's a young woman. Her home is New York. She has no near kinfolk except Sister Teresa, so she spends some of her time here. Teaches music. Not that I ever heard of. She does a lot of things well. Takes cups in golf tournaments, and is the nimblest hand at tennis you ever saw. Also, she's a fine musician and plays the organ tremendously. Well, she told me she was Olivia. I said, I should think she would, when you refused to meet her, when you had ignored her and Sister Teresa, both of them among your grandfather's best friends, and your nearest neighbors here. My grandfather be hanged. Of course I couldn't know her. We can't live on the same earth. I'm in her way, hanging on to this property here just to defeat her, when she's the finest girl alive. He nodded gravely, his eyes bent upon me with sympathy and kindness. The past events at Glenarm swept through my mind in kinetoscopic flashes, but the girl in gray talking to Arthur Pickering and his friends at the Annandale station, the girl in gray who had been an eavesdropper at the chapel, the girl in gray with the eyes of blue. It seemed that a year passed before I broke the silence. Where has she gone? I demanded. He smiled, and I was cheered by the mirth that showed in his face. Why, she's gone to Cincinnati with Olivia Gladys Armstrong, he said. They're great chums, you know. Chapter 17. Sister Teresa. There was further information I wished to obtain, and I did not blush to pluck it from Stoddard before I let him go that night. Olivia Gladys Armstrong lived in Cincinnati. Her father was a wealthy physician at Walnut Hills. Stoddard knew the family, and I asked questions about them, their antecedents and place of residence that were not perhaps impertinent in view of the fact that I had never consciously set eyes on their daughter in my life. As I look back upon it now, my information secured at that time, touching the history and social position of the Armstrongs of Walnut Hills, Cincinnati, seems excessive, but the curiosity which the Reverend Paul Stoddard satisfied with so little trouble to himself was of immediate interest and importance. As to the girl in gray, I found him far more difficult. She was Marion Devereux. She was a niece of Sister Teresa. Her home was in New York with another aunt, her parents being dead, and she was a frequent visitor at St. Agatha's. The wayward Olivia and she were on excellent terms, and when it seemed wisest for that vivacious youngster to retire from school at the mid-year recess, Miss Devereux had accompanied her home, ostensibly for a visit, but really to break the force of the blow. It was a pretty story, and enhanced my already high opinion of Miss Devereux, while at the same time I admired the unknown Olivia Gladys nonetheless. When Stoddard left me, I dug out of a drawer my copy of John Marshall Glenarm's will and reread it for the first time since Pickering gave it to me in New York. There was one provision to which I had not given a single thought, and when I had smoothed the thin typewritten sheets upon the table in my room, I read it over and over again, construing it in a new light with every reading. Provided, further, that in the event of the marriage of said John Glenarm to the said Marion Devereux, or in the event of any promise or contract of marriage between said persons within 5 years from the date of said John Glenarm's acceptance of the provisions of this will, the whole estate shall become the property absolutely of St. Agatha's School at Annandale, Wabana County, Indiana, a corporation under the laws of said state. Bully for the old boy, I muttered finally, folding the copy with something akin to reverence for my grandfather's shrewdness in closing so many doors upon his heirs. It required no lawyer to interpret this paragraph. If I could not secure his estate by settling at Glenarm for a year, I was not to gain it by marrying the alternative heir. Here, clearly, was not one of those situations so often contrived by novelists, in which the luckless heir presumptive, cut off without a cent, weds the pretty cousin who gets the fortune, and they live happily together ever afterward. John Marshall Glenarm had explicitly provided against any such frustration of his plans. Bully for you, John Marshall Glenarm. I rose and bowed low to his photograph. On top of my mail, next morning lay a small envelope, unstamped, and addressed to me in a free-running hand. Ferguson left it, explained Bates. I opened and read. If convenient, will Mr. Glenarm kindly look in at St. Agatha's some day this week at 4 o'clock. Sister Teresa wishes to see him. I whistled softly. My feelings towards Sister Teresa had been those of utter repugnance and antagonism. I had been avoiding her studiously and was not a little surprised that she should seek an interview with me. Quite possibly she wished to inquire how soon I expected to abandon Glenarm House, or perhaps she wished to admonish me as to the perils of my soul. In any event, I liked the quality of her note, and I was curious to know why she sent for me. Moreover, Marian Devereux was her niece, and that was wholly in the sister's favor. At 4 o'clock, I passed into St. Agatha territory and rang the bell at the door of the building where I had left Olivia the evening I found her in the chapel. A sister admitted me, led the way to a small reception room where, I imagined, the visiting parent was received, and left me. I felt a good deal like a schoolboy who has been summoned before a severe master for discipline. I was idly beating my hat with my gloves when a quick step sounded in the hall, and instantly a brown-clad figure appeared in the doorway. Mr. Glenarm? It was a deep, rich voice, a voice of assurance, a voice, may I say, of the world, a voice, too, may I add, of a woman who is likely to say what she means without ado. The white band at her forehead brought into relief two wonderful gray eyes that were alight with kindliness. She surveyed me a moment. Then her lips parted in a smile. This room is rather forbidding. If you will come with me. She turned with an air of authority that was a part of her undeniable distinction, and I was seated a moment later in a pretty sitting room, whose windows gave a view of the dark wood and frozen lake beyond. I'm afraid, Mr. Glenarm, that you are not disposed to be neighborly, and you must pardon me if I seem to be pursuing you. Her smile, her voice, her manner were charming. I had pictured her a sour old woman, who had hidden away from a world that had offered her no pleasure. The apologies must all be on my side, Sister Teresa. I have been greatly occupied since coming here, distressed and perplexed even. Our young ladies treasure the illusion that there are ghosts at your house, she said, with a smile that disposed of the matter. She folded her slim, white hands on her knees and spoke with a simple directness. Mr. Glenarm, there is something I wish to say to you, but I can say it only if we are to be friends. I have feared you might look upon us here as enemies. That is a strong word, I replied evasively. Let me say to you that I hope very much that nothing will prevent your inheriting all that Mr. Glenarm wished you to have from him. Thank you. That is both kind and generous, I said with no little surprise. Not in the least. I should be disloyal to your grandfather, who was my friend and the friend of my family, if I did not feel kindly toward you and wish you well. And I must say for my niece, Miss Devereux, I found a certain pleasure in pronouncing her name. Miss Devereux is very greatly disturbed over the good intentions of your grandfather in placing her name in his will. You can doubtless understand how uncomfortable a person of any sensibility would be under the circumstances. I'm sorry you have never met her. She is a very charming young woman whose happiness does not, I may say, depend on other people's money. She had never told then? I smiled at the recollection of our interviews. I am sure that is true, Sister Teresa. Now I wish to speak to you about a matter of some delicacy. It is, I understand perfectly, no business of mine how much of a fortune Mr. Glenarm left. But this matter has been brought to my attention in a disagreeable way. Your grandfather established this school. He gave most of the money for these buildings. I had other friends who offered to contribute, but he insisted on doing it all. But now Mr. Pickering insists that the money, or part of it at least, was only a loan. Yes, I understand. Mr. Pickering tells me that he has no alternative in the matter, that the law requires him to collect this money as a debt due the estate. That is undoubtedly true as a general proposition. He told me in New York that he had a claim against you for $50,000. Yes, that is the amount. I wish to say to you, Mr. Glenarm, that if it is necessary, I can pay that amount. Pray do not trouble about it, Sister Teresa. There are a good many things about my grandfather's affairs that I don't understand, but I'm not going to see an old friend of his swindled. There's more in all this than appears. My grandfather seems to have mislaid or lost most of his assets before he died. And yet he had the reputation of being a pretty cautious businessman. The impression is abroad, as you must know, that your grandfather concealed his fortune before his death. The people hereabouts believe so, and Mr. Pickering, the executor, has been unable to trace it. Yes, I believe Mr. Pickering has not been able to solve the problem, I said and laughed. But of course, you and he will cooperate in an effort to find the lost property. She bent forward slightly. Her eyes, as they met mine, examined me with a keen interest. Why shouldn't I be frank with you, Sister Teresa? I have every reason for believing Arthur Pickering a scoundrel. He does not care to cooperate with me in searching for this money. The fact is that he very much wishes to eliminate me as a factor in the settlement of the estate. I speak carefully. I know exactly what I am saying. She bowed her head slightly and was silent for a moment. The silence was the more marked from the fact that the hood of her habit concealed her face. What you say is very serious. Yes, and his offense is equally serious. It may seem odd for me to be saying this to you when I am a stranger, when you may be pardoned for having no very high opinion of me. She turned her face to me. It was singularly gentle and refined, not a face to associate with an idea of self-seeking or duplicity. I sent for you, Mr. Glenarm, because I had a very good opinion of you, because, for one reason, you are the grandson of your grandfather. And the friendly light in her gray eyes drove away any lingering doubt I may have had as to her sincerity. I wish to warn you to have a care for your own safety. I don't warn you against Arthur Pickering alone, but against the countryside. The idea of a hidden fortune is alluring. A mysterious house and a lost treasure make a very enticing combination. I fancy Mr. Glenarm did not realize that he was creating dangers for the people he wished to help. She was silent again, her eyes bent meditatively upon me. Then she spoke abruptly. Mr. Pickering wishes to marry my niece. Ah, I've been waiting to hear that. I am exceedingly glad to know that he has so noble an ambition. But Miss Devereux isn't encouraging him, as near as I can make out. She refused to go to California with his party. I happen to know that. That whole California episode would have been amusing if it had not been ridiculous. Marian never had the slightest idea of going with him, but she is sometimes a little, shall I say perverse? Please do. I like the word, and the quality, and Mr. Pickering's rather elaborate methods of wooing. He's as heavy as lead, I declared. Amuse Marian up to a certain point. Then they annoy her. He has implied pretty strongly that the claim against me could be easily adjusted if Marian marries him. But she will never marry him, whether she benefits by your grandfather's will, or however that may be. I should say not, I declared with a warmth that caused Sister Teresa to sweep me warily with those wonderful gray eyes. But first he expects to find this fortune and endow Miss Devereux with it. That is a part of the scheme, and my own interest in the estate must be eliminated before he can bring that condition about. But, Sister Teresa, I am not so easily got rid of as Arthur Pickering imagines. My staying qualities, which were always weak in the eyes of my family, have been braced up a trifle. Yes, I thought pleasure and hope were expressed in the monosyllable, and my heart warmed to her. Sister Teresa, you and I are understanding each other much better than I imagined we should. And we both laughed, feeling a real sympathy growing between us. Yes, I believe we are. And the smile lighted her face again. So, I can tell you two things. The first is that Arthur Pickering will never find my grandfather's lost fortune, assuming that any exists. The second is that in no event will he marry your niece. You speak with a good deal of confidence, she said, and laughed a low, murmuring laugh. I thought there was relief in it, but I didn't suppose Marian's affairs interested you. They don't, Sister Teresa. Her affairs are not of the slightest importance, but she is. There was frank inquiry in her eyes now. But you don't know her. You have missed your opportunity. To be sure, I don't know her, but I know Olivia Gladys Armstrong. She's a particular friend of mine. We have chased rabbits together, and she told me a great deal. I have formed a very good opinion of Miss Devereux in that way. Oh, that note you wrote about Olivia's intrusions beyond the wall. I should thank you for it, but I really didn't mind. A note? I never wrote you a note until today. Well, someone did, I said. Then she smiled. Oh, that must have been Marion. She was always Olivia's loyal friend. I should say so. Sister Teresa laughed merrily. But you shouldn't have known Olivia. It is unpardonable. If she played tricks upon you, you should not have taken advantage of them to make her acquaintance. That wasn't fair to me. I suppose not. But I protest against this deportation. The landscape hereabouts is only so much sky, snow, and lumber without her. We miss her too, replied Sister Teresa. We have less to do. And still I protest. I declared, rising. Sister Teresa, I thank you with all my heart for what you have said to me, for the disposition to say it. And this debt to the estate is something, I promise you, that shall not trouble you. Then there's a truce between us. We are not enemies at all now, are we? No. For Olivia's sake, at least, we shall be friends. I went home and studied the timetable. Chapter 18, Golden Butterflies. If you are one of those captious people who must verify by the calendar every new moon you read of in a book, and if you are pained to discover the historian lifting anchor and spreading sail contrary to the reckonings of the nautical almanac, I beg to call your attention to these items from the timetable of the Midwestern and Southern Railway for December 1901. The southbound express passed Annandale at exactly 53 minutes after 4 p.m. It was scheduled to reach Cincinnati at 11 o'clock sharp. These items are, I trust, sufficiently explicit. To the student of morals and motives, I will say a further word. I had resolved to practice deception in running away from Glenarm House to keep my promise to Marion Devereux. By leaving, I should forfeit my right to any part of my grandfather's estate. I knew that and accepted the issue without regret, but I had no intention of surrendering Glenarm House to Arthur Pickering, particularly now that I realized how completely I had placed myself in his trap. I felt, moreover, a duty to my dead grandfather, and, not least, the attacks of Morgan and the strange ways of Bates had stirred whatever fighting blood there was in me. Pickering and I were engaged in a sharp contest, and I was beginning to enjoy it to the full, but I did not falter in my determination to visit Cincinnati, hoping to return without my absence being discovered. So the next afternoon, I began preparing for my journey. Bates, I fear that I'm taking a severe cold, and I'm going to dose myself with whiskey and quinine and go to bed. I shan't want any dinner. Nothing until you see me again. I yawned and stretched myself with a groan. I'm very sorry, sir. Shan't I call a doctor? Not a bit of it. I'll sleep it off and be as lively as a cricket in the morning. At 4 o'clock, I told him to carry some hot water and lemons to my room, bade him an emphatic good night, and locked the door as he left. Then I packed my evening clothes in a suitcase. I threw the bag and a heavy ulster from a window, swung myself out upon the limb of a big maple, and let it bend under me to its sharpest curve, and then dropped lightly to the ground. I passed the gate and struck off toward the village with a joyful sense of freedom. When I reached the station, I sought at once the southbound platform, not wishing to be seen buying a ticket. A few other passengers were assembling, but I saw no one I recognized. Number 6, I heard the agent say, was on time, and in a few minutes it came roaring up. I bought a seat in the Washington sleeper and went into the dining car for supper. The train was full of people hurrying to various ports for the holidays, but they had, I reflected, no advantage over me. I, too, was bound on a definite errand, though my journey was, I imagined, less commonplace in its character than the homing flight of most of my fellow travelers. I made myself comfortable and dozed and dreamed as the train plunged through the dark. There was a wait, with much shifting of cars, where we crossed the Wabash, then we sped on. It grew warmer as we drew southward, and the conductor was confident we should reach Cincinnati on time. The through passengers about me went to bed, and I was left sprawled out in my open section, lurking on the shadowy frontier between the known world and dreamland. We're running into Cincinnati. 10 minutes late, said the porter's voice, and in a moment I was in the vestibule and out, hurrying to a hotel. At the street Botolph, I ordered a carriage and broke all records changing my clothes. The timetable informed me that the Northern Express left at 1:30. There was no reason why I should not be safe at Glenarm House by my usual breakfast hour if all went well. To avoid loss of time in returning to the station, I paid the hotel charge and carried my bag away with me. Dr. Armstrong's residence? Yes, sir. I've already taken one load there. The carriage was soon climbing what seemed to be a mountain to the heights above Cincinnati. To this day, I associate Ohio's most interesting city with a lonely carriage ride that seemed to be chiefly uphill, through a region that was as strange to me as a trackless jungle in the wilds of Africa. And my heart began to perform strange tattoos on my ribs. I was going to the house of a gentleman who did not know of my existence, to see a girl who was his guest, to whom I had never, as the conventions go, been presented. It did not seem half so easy, now that I was well launched upon the adventure. I stopped the cabman just as he was about to enter an iron gateway whose posts bore two great lamps. "That is all right, sir. I can drive right in." "But you needn't," I said, jumping out. "Wait here." Dr. Armstrong's residence was brilliantly lighted, and the strains of a waltz stole across the lawn cheerily. Several carriages swept past me as I followed the walk. I was arriving at a fashionable hour. It was nearly 12, and just how to effect an entrance without being thrown out as an interloper was a formidable problem, now that I had reached the house. I must catch my train home, and this left no margin for explanation to an outraged host whose first impulse would very likely be to turn me over to the police. I made a detour and studied the house, seeking a door by which I could enter without passing the unfriendly Gibraltar of a host and hostess on guard to welcome belated guests. A long conservatory filled with tropical plants gave me my opportunity. Promenaders went idly through and out into another part of the house by an exit I could not see. A handsome, spectacled gentleman opened a glass door within a yard of where I stood, sniffed the air, and said to his companion, as he turned back with a shrug into the conservatory, "There's no sign of snow. It isn't Christmas weather at all." He strolled away through the palms, and I instantly threw off my ulster and hat, cast them behind some bushes, and boldly opened the door and entered. The ballroom was on the third floor, but the guests were straggling down to supper, and I took my stand at the foot of the broad stairway and glanced up carelessly, as though waiting for someone. It was a large and brilliant company, and many a lovely face passed me as I stood waiting. The very size of the gathering gave me security, and I smoothed my gloves complacently. The spectacled gentleman whose breath of night air had given me a valued hint of the open conservatory door came now and stood beside me. He even put his hand on my arm with intimate friendliness. There was a sound of mirth and scampering feet in the hall above, and then down the steps, between the lines of guests arrested in their descent, came a dark laughing girl in the garb of Little Red Riding Hood, amid general applause and laughter. "It's Olivia! She's won the wager!" exclaimed the spectacled gentleman, and the girl, whose dark curls were shaken about her face, ran up to us and threw her arms about him and kissed him. It was a charming picture. The figures on the stairway, the pretty, graceful child, the eager, happy faces all about. I was too much interested by this scene of the comedy to be uncomfortable. Then, at the top of the stair, her height accented by her gown of white, stood Marian Devereux, hesitating an instant, as a bird pauses before taking wing, and then laughingly running between the lines to where Olivia faced her in mock objection. To the charm of the girl in the woodland was added now the dignity of beautiful womanhood, and my heart leaped at the thought that I had ever spoken to her, that I was there because she had taunted me with the risk of coming. Above, on the stair landing, a deep-toned clock began to strike midnight, and everyone cried Merry Christmas. And Olivia's won, and there was more hand-clapping, in which I joined with goodwill. Someone behind me was explaining what had just occurred. Olivia, the youngest daughter of the house, had been denied a glimpse of the ball. Miss Devereux had made a wager with her host that Olivia would appear before midnight, and Olivia had defeated the plot against her, and gained the main hall at the stroke of Christmas. "Good night! Good night!" called Olivia, the real Olivia, in derision to the company, and turned and ran back through the applauding, laughing throng. The spectacled gentleman was Olivia's father, and he mockingly rebuked Marian Devereux for having encouraged an infraction of parental discipline, while she was twitting him upon the loss of his wager. Then her eyes rested upon me for the first time. She smiled slightly, but continued talking placidly to her host. The situation did not please me. I had not traveled so far and burglariously entered Dr. Armstrong's house in quest of a girl with blue eyes merely to stand by while she talked to another man. I drew nearer, impatiently, and was conscious that 4 other young men in white waistcoats and gloves quite as irreproachable as my own stood ready to claim her the instant she was free. I did not propose to be thwarted by the beaux of Cincinnati, so I stepped toward Dr. Armstrong. "I beg your pardon, doctor," I said with an assurance for which I blushed to this hour. "All right, my boy. I, too, have been in Arcady," he exclaimed in cheerful apology, and she put her hand on my arm, and I led her away. "He called me my boy, so I must be passing muster," I remarked, not daring to look at her. "He's afraid not to recognize you. His inability to remember faces is a town joke." We reached a quiet corner of the great hall, and I found a seat for her. "You don't seem surprised to see me. You knew I would come. I should have come across the world for this. For just this?" Her eyes were grave at once. "Why did you come? I did not think you were so foolish. This is all. So wretched, so unfortunate. You didn't know that Mr. Pickering—" "Mr. Pickering?" She was greatly distressed, and this name came from her chokingly. "Yes, what of him?" I laughed. "He is well on his way to California. And without you." She spoke hurriedly, eagerly, bending toward me. "No, you don't know, you don't understand. He's here. He abandoned his California trip at Chicago. He telegraphed me to expect him. Here tonight. You must go at once. At once." "Ah, but you can't frighten me," I said, trying to realize just what a meeting with Pickering in that house might mean. "No," she looked anxiously about. "They were to arrive late. He and the Taylors. They know the Armstrongs quite well. They may come at any moment now. Please go." "But I have only a few minutes myself. You wouldn't have me sit them out in the station downtown? There are some things I have come to say, and Arthur Pickering and I are not afraid of each other. But you must not meet him here. Think what that would mean to me." "You are very foolhardy, Mr. Glenarm. I had no idea you would come. But you wished to try me. You challenged me." "That wasn't me. It was Olivia." She laughed, more at ease, I thought. "Yes, what did you think?" I asked. "That I was tied hand and foot by a dead man's money?" "No, it wasn't that wretched fortune. But I enjoyed playing the child before you. I really love Olivia, and it seemed that the fairies were protecting me, and that I could play being a child to the very end of the chapter without any real mischief coming of it." "I wish I were Olivia," she declared, her eyes away from me. "That's rather idle. I'm not really sure yet what your name is, and I don't care. Let's imagine that we haven't any names. I'm sure my name isn't of any use, and I'll be glad to go nameless all my days if only—" "If only," she repeated idly, opening and closing her fan. It was a frail blue trifle, painted in golden butterflies. There are so many if-onlys that I hesitate to choose, but I will venture one. If only you will come back to St. Agatha's, not tomorrow or the next day, but, say, with the first bluebirds. I believe they are the harbingers up there." Her very ease was a balm to my spirit. She was now a veritable daughter of repose. One arm in its long white sheath lay quiet in her lap. Her right hand held the golden butterflies against the soft curve of her cheek. A collar of pearls clasped her throat and accented the clear, girlish lines of her profile. I felt the appeal of her youth and purity. It was like a cry in my heart, and I forgot the dreary house by the lake and Pickering and the weeks within the stone walls of my prison. The friends who know me best never expect me to promise to be anywhere at a given time. I can't tell. Perhaps I shall follow the bluebirds to Indiana. But why should I, when I can't play being Olivia anymore? No, I am very dull. That note of apology you wrote from the school really fooled me. But I have seen the real Olivia now. I don't want you to go too far. Not where I can't follow. This flight I shall hardly dare repeat. Her lips closed, like a rose that had gone back to be a bud again, and she pondered a moment, slowly freeing and imprisoning the golden butterflies. "You have risked a fortune, Mr. Glenarm, very, very foolishly, and more, if you were found here. Why, Olivia must have recognized you. She must have seen you often across the wall. But I don't care. I'm not staying at that ruin up there for money. My grandfather meant more to me than that. Yes, I believe that is so. He was a dear old gentleman, and he liked me because I thought his jokes adorable. My father and he had known each other, but there was no expectation, no wish to profit by his friendship. My name in his will is a great embarrassment, a source of real annoyance. The newspapers have printed dreadful pictures of me. That is why I say to you, quite frankly, that I wouldn't accept a cent of Mr. Glenarm's money if it were offered me. And that is why. And her smile was a flash of spring. I want you to obey the terms of the will and earn your fortune. She closed the fan sharply and lifted her eyes to mine. But there isn't any fortune. It's all a myth, a joke, I declared. Mr. Pickering doesn't seem to think so. He had every reason for believing that Mr. Glenarm was a very rich man. The property can't be found in the usual places, banks, safety vaults, and the like. Then where do you think it is? Or better, where do you think Mr. Pickering thinks it is? But assuming that it's buried up there by the lake like a pirate's treasure, it isn't Pickering's if he finds it. There are laws to protect even the dead from robbery. I concluded hotly. How difficult you are. Suppose you should fall from a boat or be shot accidentally. Then I might have to take the fortune after all, and Mr. Pickering might think of an easier way of getting it than by stealing it. Yes, but you wouldn't. 12:30 struck on the stairway, and I started to my feet. You wouldn't, I repeated. I might, you know. I must go, but not with that. Not with any hint of that. Please. If you let him defeat you, if you fail to spend your year there, we'll overlook this one lapse. She looked me steadily in the eyes, wholly guiltless of coquetry, but infinitely kind. Then she paused, opened the fan, held it up to the light, and studied the golden butterflies. Yes. Then, let me see. Oh, I shall never chase another rabbit as long as I live. Now go, quickly, quickly. But you haven't told me when and where it was we met the first time. Please. She laughed, but urged me away with her eyes. I shan't do it. It isn't proper for me to remember if your memory is so poor. I wonder how it would seem for us to meet just once and be introduced. Good night. You really came. You are a gentleman of your word, Squire Glenarm. She gave me the tips of her fingers without looking at me. A servant came in hurriedly. Miss Devereux, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, and Mr. Pickering are in the drawing room. Yes. Very well. I will come at once. Then to me. They must not see you. There, that way. And she stood in the door, facing me, her hands lightly touching the frame as though to secure my way. I turned for a last look and saw her waiting. Her eyes bent gravely upon me, her arms still half raised, barring the door. Then she turned swiftly away into the hall. Outside, I found my hat and coat and wakened my sleeping driver. He drove like mad into the city, and I swung upon the northbound sleeper just as it was drawing out of the station. Chapter 19. I meet an old friend. When I reached the house, I found, to my astonishment, that the window I had left open as I scrambled out the night before was closed. I dropped my bag and crept to the front door, thinking that if Bates had discovered my absence, it was useless to attempt any further deception. I was amazed to find the great doors of the main entrance flung wide, and in real alarm I ran through the hall and back to the library. The nearest door stood open, and, as I peered in, a curious scene disclosed itself. A few of the large cathedral candles still burned brightly in several places, their flame rising strangely in the gray morning light. Books had been taken from the shelves and scattered everywhere, and sharp implements had cut ugly gashes in the shelving. The drawers containing sketches and photographs had been pulled out and their contents thrown about and trampled underfoot. The house was as silent as a tomb, but as I stood on the threshold trying to realize what had happened, something stirred by the fireplace, and I crept forward, listening, until I stood by the long table beneath the great chandelier. Again I heard a sound as of some animal waking and stretching, followed by a moan that was undoubtedly human. Then the hands of a man clutched the farther edge of the table, and slowly and evidently with infinite difficulty a figure rose, and the dark face of Bates, with eyes blurred and staring strangely, confronted me. He drew his body to its height and leaned heavily upon the table. I snatched a candle and bent toward him to make sure my eyes were not tricking me. "Mr. Glenarm! Mr. Glenarm!" he exclaimed in broken whispers. "It is Bates, sir. What have you done? What has happened?" I demanded. He put his hand to his head uncertainly and gaped as though trying to gather his wits. He was evidently dazed by whatever had occurred, and I sprang around and helped him to a couch. He would not lie down but sat up, staring and passing his hand over his head. It was rapidly growing lighter, and I saw a purple and black streak across his temple where a bludgeon of some sort had struck him. "What does this mean, Bates? Who has been in the house?" "I can't tell you, Mr. Glenarm. Can't tell me. You will tell me or go to jail. There's been mischief done here, and I don't intend to have any nonsense about it from you." Well, he was clearly suffering, but in my anger at the sight of the wreck of the room, I grasped his shoulder and shook him roughly. "It was early this morning," he faltered. "About 2 o'clock, I heard noises in the lower part of the house. I came down thinking likely it was you, and remembering that you had been sick yesterday." "Yes, go on." The thought of my truancy was no balm to my conscience just then. As I came into the hall, I saw lights in the library. As you weren't down last night, the room hadn't been lighted at all. I heard steps and someone tapping with a hammer. Yes, a hammer. Go on. It was then the same old story. The war had been carried openly into the house. But Bates, just why should anyone connected with the conspiracy injure Bates, who stood so near to Pickering, its leader? The fellow was undoubtedly hurt. There was no mistaking the lump on his head. He spoke with a painful difficulty that was not assumed. I felt increasingly sure as he went on. I saw a man pulling out the books and tapping the inside of the shelves. He was working very fast, and the next thing I knew, he let in another man through one of the terrace doors, the one there that still stands a little open. He flinched as he turned slightly to indicate it, and his face twitched with pain. "Never mind that. Tell the rest of your story." Then I ran in, grabbed one of the big candelabra from the table, and went for the nearest man. They were about to begin on the chimney breast there. It was Mr. Glenarm's pride in all the house, and that accounts for my being there in front of the fireplace. "They rather got the best of me, sir." "Clearly, I see they did. You had a hand-to-hand fight with them, and, being 2-1, no, there were 2 of us. Don't you understand? 2 of us. There was another man who came running in from somewhere, and he took sides with me. I thought at first it was you. The robbers thought so, too, for one of them yelled, 'Great God, it's Glenarm,' just like that. But it wasn't you, but quite another person. That's a good story so far. And then what happened? I don't remember much more, except that someone soused me with water that helped my head considerably, and the next thing I knew, I was staring across the table there at you. Who were these men? Bates? Speak up quickly." My tone was peremptory. Here was, I felt, a crucial moment in our relations. "Well," he began deliberately, "I dislike to make charges against a fellow man, but I strongly suspect one of the men of being. Yes, tell the whole truth, or it will be the worse for you. I very much fear one of them was Ferguson, the gardener over the way." "I'm disappointed in him, sir." "Very good. And now for the other one. I didn't get my eyes on him. I had closed with Ferguson, and we were having quite a lively time of it when the other one came in. Then the man who came to my help mixed us all up. He was a very lively person. And what became of Ferguson and the rest of it I don't know. There was food for thought in what he said. He had taken punishment in defense of my property. The crack on his head was undeniable, and I could not abuse him or question his veracity with any grace. Not, at least, without time for investigation and study. However, I ventured to ask him one question. "If you were guessing, shouldn't you think it quite likely that Morgan was the other man?" He met my gaze squarely. "I think it wholly possible, Mr. Glenarm. And the man who helped you, who in the devil was he? Bless me, I don't know." He disappeared. "I'd like mightily to see him again." "Humph! Now you'd better do something for your head. I'll summon the village doctor if you say so." "No, thank you, sir. I'll take care of it myself. And now we'll keep quiet about this. Don't mention it or discuss it with anyone." "Certainly not, sir." He rose and staggered a little, but crossed to the broad mantel shelf in the great chimney breast, rested his arm upon it for a moment, passed his hand over the dark wood with a sort of caress, then bent his eyes upon the floor littered with books and drawings and papers torn from the cabinets, and all splashed with tallow and wax from the candles. The daylight had increased until the havoc wrought by the night's visitors was fully apparent. The marauders had made a sorry mess of the room, and I thought Bates' lip quivered as he saw the wreck. It would have been a blow to Mr. Glenarm. The room was his pride, sir. He went out toward the kitchen, and I ran upstairs to my own room. I cursed the folly that had led me to leave my window open, for undoubtedly Morgan and his new ally, St. Agatha's gardener, had taken advantage of it to enter the house. Quite likely, too, they had observed my absence, and this would undoubtedly be communicated to Pickering. I threw open my door and started back with an exclamation of amazement. Standing at my chiffonier, between two windows, was a man, clad in a bath gown. My own, I saw with fury, his back to me, the razor at his face, placidly shaving himself. Without turning, he addressed me, quite coolly and casually, as though his being there was the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning, Mr. Glenarm. Rather damaging evidence, that costume. I suppose it's the custom of the country for gentlemen in evening clothes to go out by the window and return by the door. You might think the other way round preferable." "Larry!" I shouted. "Jack! Kick that door shut and lock it," he commanded in a sharp, severe tone that I remembered well and just now welcomed in him. "How, why, and when?" "Never mind about me. I'm here, thrown the enemy off for a few days, and you give me lessons in current history first while I climb into my armor. Pray pardon the informality." He seized a broom and began work upon a pair of trousers to which mud and briars clung tenaciously. His coat and hat lay on a chair, they, too, much the worse for rough wear. There was never any use in refusing to obey Larry's orders, and as he got into his clothes I gave him in as few words as possible the chief incidents that had marked my stay at Glenarm House. He continued dressing with care, helping himself to a shirt and collar from my chiffonier and choosing with unfailing eye the best tie in my collection. Now and then he asked a question tersely, or again he laughed or swore direly in Gaelic. When I had concluded the story of Pickering's visit, and of the conversation I overheard between the executor and Bates in the church porch, Larry wheeled round with the scarf half-tied in his fingers and surveyed me commiseratingly. "And you didn't rush them both on the spot and have it out?" "No. I was too much taken aback, for one thing. I dare say you were. And for another, I didn't think the time ripe. I'm going to beat that fellow, Larry, but I want him to show his hand fully before we come to a smash-up. I know as much about the house and its secrets as he does. That's one consolation. Sometimes I don't believe there's a shilling here, and again, I'm sure there's a big stake in it. The fact that Pickering is risking so much to find what's supposed to be hidden here is pretty fair evidence that something's buried on the place. Possibly, but they're giving you a lively boycott. Now, where in the devil have you been?" "Well," I began and hesitated. I had not mentioned Marion Devereux, and this did not seem the time for confidences of that sort. He took a cigarette from his pocket and lighted it. "Bah, these women. Under the terms of your revered grandfathers, will you have thrown away all your rights? It looks to me, as a member of the Irish bar in bad standing, as though you had delivered yourself up to the enemy, so far as the legal situation is concerned. How does it strike you? Of course I've forfeited my rights, but I don't mean that anyone shall know it yet a while. My lad, don't deceive yourself. Everybody round here will know it before night. You ran off, left your window open invitingly, and two gentlemen who meditated breaking in found that they needn't take the trouble. One came in through your own room, noting, of course, your absence, let in his friend below, and tore up the place regrettably. Yes, but how did you get here? If you don't mind telling. It's a short story. That little chap from Scotland Yard, who annoyed me so much in New York and drove me to Mexico, for which may he dwell forever in fiery torment, has never given up. I shook him off, though, at Indianapolis 3 days ago. I bought a ticket for Pittsburgh with him at my elbow. I suppose he thought the chase was growing tame, and that the farther east he could arrest me the nearer I should be to a British consul in Tidewater. I went ahead of him into the station and out to the Pittsburgh sleeper. I dropped my bag into my section, if that's what they call it in your atrocious American language, looked out and saw him coming along the platform. Just then the car began to move. They were shunting it about to attach a sleeper that had been brought in from Louisville, and my carriage, or whatever you call it, went skimming out of the sheds into a yard where everything seemed to be most noisy and complex. I dropped off in the dark just before they began to haul the carriage back. A long train of empty goods wagons was just pulling out, and I threw my bag into a wagon and climbed after it. We kept going for an hour or so until I was thoroughly lost. Then I took advantage of a stop at a place that seemed to be the end of terrestrial things, got out, and started across country. I expressed my bag to you the other day from a town that rejoiced in the cheering name of Kokomo, just to get rid of it. I walked into Annandale about midnight, found this medieval marvel through the kindness of the station master, and was reconnoitering with my usual caution when I saw a gentleman romantically entering through an open window. Larry paused to light a fresh cigarette. You always did have a way of arriving opportunely. Go on. It pleased my fancy to follow him, and by the time I had studied your diggings here a trifle, things began to happen below. It sounded like a St. Patrick's Day celebration in an Irish village, and I went down at a gallop to see if there was any chance of breaking in. Have you seen the room? Well, he gave several turns to his right wrist, as though to test it. We all had a jolly time there by the fireplace. Another chap had got in somewhere, so there were two of them. Your man, I suppose it's your man, was defending himself gallantly with a large thing of brass that looked like the pipes of a grand organ, and I sailed in with a chair. My presence seemed to surprise the attacking party, who evidently thought I was you. Flattering, I must say, to me. You undoubtedly saved Bates' life and prevented the rifling of the house. And after you had poured water on Bates, he's the servant, you came up here. That's the way of it. You're a brick, Larry Donovan. There's only one of you. And now, John Glenarm, we got to get down to business, or you must. As for me, after a few hours of your enlivening society, you don't go a step until we go together. No, by the beard of the prophet. I've a fight on here, and I'm going to win if I die in the struggle, and you've got to stay with me to the end. But under the will you dare not take a boarder. Of course I dare. That will's as though it had never been as far as I'm concerned. My grandfather never expected me to sit here alone and be murdered. John Marshall Glenarm wasn't a fool exactly. No, but a trifle queer, I should say. I don't have to tell you, old man, that this situation appeals to me. It's my kind of a job. If it weren't that the hounds are at my heels, I'd like to stay with you. But you have enough trouble on hands without opening the house to an attack by my enemies. Stop talking about it. I don't propose to be deserted by the only friend I have in the world when I'm up to my eyes in trouble. Let's go down and get some coffee. We found Bates trying to remove the evidences of the night's struggle. He had fastened a cold pack about his head and limped slightly. Otherwise, he was the same, silent and inexplicable. Daylight had not improved the appearance of the room. Several hundred books lay scattered over the floor, and the shelves which had held them were hacked and broken. Bates, if you can give us some coffee? Let the room go for the present. Yes, sir. And Bates. He paused, and Larry's keen eyes were bent sharply upon him. Mr. Donovan is a friend who will be with me for some time. We'll fix up his room later in the day. He limped out, Larry's eyes following him. What do you think of that fellow? I asked. Larry's face wore a puzzled look. What do you call him? Bates? He's a plucky fellow. Larry picked up from the hearth the big candelabrum with which Bates had defended himself. It was badly bent and twisted, and Larry grinned. The fellow who went out through the front door probably isn't feeling very well today. Your man was swinging this thing like a windmill. I can't understand it, I muttered. I can't, for the life of me, see why he should have given battle to the enemy. They all belong to Pickering, and Bates is the biggest rascal of the bunch. Humph! We'll consider that later. And would you mind telling me what kind of a tallow foundry this is? I never saw so many candlesticks in my life. I seem to taste tallow. I had no letters from you, and I suppose you were loafing quietly in a grim farmhouse, dying of ennui. And here you are in an establishment that ought to be the imperial residence of an Eskimo chief. Possibly you have crude petroleum for soup and whipped salad oil for dessert. I declare, a man living here ought to attain a high candle power of luminosity. It's perfectly immense. He stared and laughed. And hidden treasure in night attacks and young virgins in the middle distance. Yes, I'd really like to stay a while. As we ate breakfast, I filled in gaps I had left in my hurried narrative, with relief that I cannot describe filling my heart as I leaned again upon the sympathy of an old and trusted friend. As Bates came, and when I marked Larry's scrutiny of the man, I dismissed him as soon as possible that we might talk freely. Take it up and down and all around. What do you think of all this? I asked. Larry was silent for a moment. He was not given to careless speech in personal matters. There's more to it than frightening you off or getting your grandfather's money. It's my guess that there's something in this house that somebody, Pickering supposedly, is very anxious to find. Yes, I begin to think so. He could come in here legally if it were merely a matter of searching for lost assets. Yes, and whatever it is, it must be well hidden. As I remember, your grandfather died in June. You got a letter calling you home in October. It was sent out blindly, with not one chance in 100 that it would ever reach me. To be sure, you were a wanderer on the face of the earth, and there was nobody in America to look after your interests. You may be sure that the place was thoroughly ransacked while you were sailing home. I'll wager you the best dinner you ever ate that there's more at stake than your grandfather's money. The situation is inspiring. I grow interested. I'm almost persuaded to linger. Chapter 20. A Triple Alliance. Larry refused to share my quarters and chose a room for himself, which Bates fitted up out of the house stores. I did not know what Bates might surmise about Larry, but he accepted my friend in good part, as a guest who would remain indefinitely. He seemed to interest Larry, whose eyes followed the man inquiringly. When we went into Bates' room on our tour of the house, Larry scanned the books on a little shelf with something more than a casual eye. There were exactly 4 volumes: Shakespeare's comedies, The Faerie Queene, Sterne's Sentimental Journey, and Yeats' Land of Heart's Desire. A queer customer, Larry. Nobody but my grandfather could ever have discovered him. He found him up in Vermont. I suppose his being a bloomin' Yankee naturally accounts for this, remarked Larry, taking from under the pillow of the narrow iron bed a copy of the Dublin Freeman's Journal. It is a little odd, I said, but if you found a Yiddish newspaper or an Egyptian papyrus under his pillow, I should not be surprised. Nor I, said Larry. I'll wager that not another shelf in this part of the world contains exactly that collection of books, and nothing else. You will notice that there was once a book plate in each of these volumes, and that it's been scratched out with care. On a small table were pen and ink and a curious, much-worn portfolio. He always gets the mail first, doesn't he? Asked Larry. Yes, I believe he does. I thought so, and I'll swear he never got a letter from Vermont in his life. When we went down, Bates was limping about the library, endeavoring to restore order. Bates, I said to him, you are a very curious person. I have had 1,001 opinions about you since I came here, and I still don't make you out. He turned from the shelves, a defaced volume in his hands. Yes, sir. It was a good deal that way with your lamented grandfather. He always said I puzzled him. Larry, safe behind the fellow's back, made no attempt to conceal a smile. I want to thank you for your heroic efforts to protect the house last night. You acted nobly, and I must confess, Bates, that I didn't think it was in you. You've got the right stuff in you. I'm only sorry that there are black pages in your record that I can't reconcile with your manly conduct of last night. But we've got to come to an understanding. Yes, sir. The most outrageous attacks have been made on me since I came here. You know what I mean well enough. Mr. Glenarm never intended that I should sit down in his house and be killed or robbed. He was the gentlest being that ever lived, and I'm going to fight for his memory and to protect his property from the scoundrels who have plotted against me. I hope you follow me. Yes, Mr. Glenarm. He was regarding me attentively. His lips quavered, perhaps from weakness, for he certainly looked ill. Now I offer you your choice, either to stand loyally by me in my grandfather's house, or to join these scoundrels Arthur Pickering has hired to drive me out. I'm not going to bribe you. I don't offer you a cent for standing by me, but I won't have a traitor in the house, and if you don't like me or my terms, I want you to go and go now. He straightened quickly, his eyes lighted, and the color crept into his face. I had never before seen him appear so like a human being. Mr. Glenarm, you have been hard on me. There have been times when you have been very unjust. Unjust? My God, what do you expect me to take from you? Haven't I known that you were in league with Pickering? I'm not as dull as I look. And after your interview with Pickering in the chapel porch, you can't convince me that you were faithful to my interests at that time." He started and gazed at me wonderingly. I had had no intention of using the chapel porch interview at this time, but it leaped out of me uncontrollably. "I suppose, sir," he began brokenly, "that I can hardly persuade you that I meant no wrong on that occasion. You certainly cannot, and it's safer for you not to try. But I'm willing to let all that go as a reward for your work last night. Make your choice now. Stay here and stop your spying, or clear out of Annandale within an hour." He took a step toward me. The table was between us, and he drew quite near but stood clear of it, erect until there was something almost soldierly and commanding in his figure. "By God, I will stand by you, John Glenarm," he said, and struck the table smartly with his clenched hand. He flushed instantly, and I felt the blood mounting into my own face as we gazed at each other. He Bates, the servant, and I, his master. He had always addressed me so punctiliously with the absurd of respect that his declaration of fealty, spoken with so sincere and vigorous an air of independence, and with the bold emphasis of the oath, held me spellbound, staring at him. The silence was broken by Larry, who sprang forward and grasped Bates' hand. "I too, Bates," I said, feeling my heart leap with liking, even with admiration for the real manhood that seemed to transfigure this hireling. This fellow whom I had charged with most infamous treachery, this servant who had cared for my needs in so humble a spirit of subjection. The knocker on the front door sounded peremptorily, and Bates turned away without another word and admitted Stoddard, who came in hurriedly. "Merry Christmas," in his big hearty tones, was hardly consonant with the troubled look on his face. I introduced him to Larry and asked him to sit down. "Pray excuse our disorder. We didn't do it for fun. It was one of Santa Claus' tricks." He stared about wonderingly. "So you caught it too, did you?" "To be sure. You don't mean to say that they raided the chapel?" "That's exactly what I mean to say. When I went into the church for my early service, I found that someone had ripped off the wainscoting in a half a dozen places and even pried up the altar. It's the most outrageous thing I ever knew. You've heard of the proverbial poverty of the church mouse. What do you suppose anybody could want to raid a simple little country chapel for? And more curious yet, the church plate was untouched, though the closet where it's kept was upset, as though the miscreants had been looking for something they didn't find." Stoddard was greatly disturbed and gazed about the topsy-turvy library with growing indignation. We drew together for a council of war. Here was an opportunity to enlist a new recruit on my side. I already felt stronger by reason of Larry's accession. As to Bates, my mind was still numb and bewildered. "Larry, there's no reason why we shouldn't join forces with Mr. Stoddard, as he seems to be affected by this struggle. We owe it to him and the school to put him on guard, particularly since we know that Ferguson's with the enemy." "Yes, certainly," said Larry. He always liked or disliked new people unequivocally, and I was glad to see that he surveyed the big clergyman with approval. "I'll begin at the beginning," I said, "and tell you the whole story." He listened quietly to the end while I told him of my experience with Morgan, of the tunnel into the chapel crypt, and finally of the affair in the night and our interview with Bates. "I feel like rubbing my eyes and accusing you of reading penny horrors," he said. "That doesn't sound like the 20th century in Indiana. But Ferguson, you'd better have a care in his direction. Sister Teresa, bless your heart. Ferguson's gone, without notice. He got his traps and skipped without saying a word to anyone. We'll hear from him again, no doubt. Now, gentlemen, I believe we understand one another. I don't like to draw you, either one of you, into my private affairs." The big chaplain laughed. "Glenarm, prefixes went out of commission quickly that morning. If you hadn't let me in on this, I should never have got over it. Why, this is a page out of the good old times. Bless me, I never appreciated your grandfather. I must run. I have another service. But I hope you gentlemen will call on me, day or night, for anything I can do to help you. Please don't forget me. I had the record once for putting the shot. Why not give our friend escort through the tunnel?" asked Larry. "I'll not hesitate to say that I'm dying to see it." "To be sure." We went down into the cellar and poked over the lantern and candlestick collections, and I pointed out the exact spot where Morgan and I had indulged in our revolver duel. It was fortunate that the plastered walls of the cellar showed clearly the cuts and scars of the pistol balls, or I fear my story would have fallen on incredulous ears. The debris I had piled upon the false block of stone in the cellar lay as I had left it, but the three of us quickly freed the trap. The humor of the thing took strong hold of my new allies, and while I was getting a lantern to light us through the passage, Larry sat on the edge of the trap and howled a few bars of a wild Irish jig. We set forth at once and found the passage unchanged. When the cold air blew in upon us, I paused. "Have you gentlemen the slightest idea of where you are?" "We must be under the school grounds, I should say," replied Stoddard. "We're exactly under the stone wall. Those tall posts at the gate are a scheme for keeping fresh air in the passage." "You certainly have all the modern improvements," observed Larry, and I heard him chuckling all the way to the crypt door. When I pushed the panel open and we stepped out into the crypt, Stoddard whistled, and Larry swore softly. "It must be for something," exclaimed the chaplain. "You don't suppose Mr. Glenarm built a secret passage just for the fun of it, do you? He must have had some purpose. Why, I sleep out here within 40 yards of where we stand, and I never had the slightest idea of this." "But other people seem to know of it," observed Larry. To be sure, the curiosity of the whole countryside was undoubtedly piqued by the building of Glenarm House. The fact that workmen were brought from a distance was in itself enough to arouse interest. Morgan seems to have discovered the passage without any trouble. More likely it was Ferguson. "He was the sexton of the church and had a chance to investigate," said Stoddard. "And now, gentlemen, I must go to my service. I'll see you again before the day is over. And we make no confidences," I admonished. "Steph, I believe that is the proper expression under all the circumstances." And the Reverend Paul Stoddard laughed, clasped my hand, and went up into the chapel vestry. I closed the door in the wainscoting and hung the map back in place. We went up into the little chapel and found a small company of worshippers assembled, a few people from the surrounding farms, half a dozen sisters sitting somberly near the chancel, and the school servants. Stoddard came out into the chancel, lighted the altar tapers, and began the Anglican communion office. I had forgotten what a church service was like, and Larry, I felt sure, had not attended church since the last time his family had dragged him to choral vespers. It was comforting to know that here was, at least, one place of peace within reach of Glenarm House. But I may be forgiven, I hope, if my mind wandered that morning, and my thoughts played hide-and-seek with memory. For it was here, in the winter twilight, that Marian Devereux had poured out her girl's heart in a great flood of melody. I was glad that the organ was closed. It would have wrung my heart to hear a note from it that her hands did not evoke. When we came out upon the church porch, and I stood on the steps to allow Larry to study the grounds, one of the brown-robed sisterhood spoke my name. It was Sister Teresa. "Can you come in for a moment?" she asked. "I will follow at once," I said. She met me in the reception room, where I had seen her before. "I'm sorry to trouble you on Christmas Day with my affairs, but I have had a letter from Mr. Pickering, saying that he will be obliged to bring suit for settlement of my account with Mr. Glenarm's estate. I needn't say that this troubles me greatly. In my position, a lawsuit is uncomfortable. It would do a real harm to the school. Mr. Pickering implies, in a very disagreeable way, that I exercised an undue influence over Mr. Glenarm. You can readily understand that that is not a pleasant accusation." "He is going pretty far," I said. "He gives me credit for a degree of power over others that I regret to say I do not possess. He thinks, for instance, that I am responsible for Miss Devereux's attitude toward him, something that I have had nothing whatever to do with. No, of course not. I'm glad you have no harsh feeling toward her. It was unfortunate that Mr. Glenarm saw fit to mention her in his will. It has given her a great deal of notoriety, and has doubtless strengthened the impression in some minds that she and I really plotted to get as much as possible of your grandfather's estate. No one would regret all this more than my grandfather. I am sure of that. There are many inexplicable things about his affairs. It seems hardly possible that a man so shrewd as he, and so thoughtful of the feelings of others, should have left so many loose ends behind him. But I assure you I am giving my whole attention to these matters, and I am wholly at your service in anything I can do to help you. I sincerely hope that nothing may interfere to prevent your meeting Mr. Glenarm's wish that you remain through the year." That was a curious and whimsical provision, but it is not, I imagine, so difficult. She spoke in a kindly tone of encouragement that made me feel uneasy and almost ashamed for having already forfeited my claim under the will. Her beautiful gray eyes disconcerted me. I had not the heart to deceive her. I have already made it impossible for me to inherit under the will, I said. The disappointment in her face rebuked me sharply. I am sorry, very sorry indeed, she said coldly. But how, may I ask? I ran away last night. I went to Cincinnati to see Miss Devereux. She rose, staring in dumb astonishment, and after a full minute in which I tried vainly to think of something to say, I left the house. There is nothing in the world so tiresome as explanations, and I have never in my life tried to make them without floundering into seas of trouble. Thank you for listening to Part 2 of The House of 1,000 Candles by Meredith Nicholson. We hope you're enjoying the story. If you are, please like, share, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when the final part is released. Stay tuned for the thrilling conclusion in Part 3, coming soon.